What if Stephen King wrote The Great Gatsby? Books are not just about the story, they're about the voice. Every successful author has something that makes their work instantly recognizable. When I say Stephen King has a new book out, you know exactly what to expect. This isn't just writing style, it's branding. So I had this idea. What if we took classic stories and rebranded them in the voice of different authors? Same plot, same characters, but told through a completely different lens. I used our good friend ChatGPT to explore this, and today's experiment is The Great Gatsby if it were written in the voice of Stephen King. Now, the plot doesn't change. Gatsby is still throwing lavish parties, Daisy is still this unattainable dream, and Nick Carraway is still observing it all with quiet fascination. But the tone? Completely different. The glitz of the jazz age is not glamorous anymore, it's hollow, like a thin layer of gold spray paint hiding the rot underneath. That's the power of voice. It's not about what's being told, it's about how it's being told. And this is exactly what branding is in marketing. Think of the same product rebranded by two different companies. One sells it as a luxury item, the other sells it as essential and practical. Same product, different story. So here it is.
The Great Gatsby, written in the style of Stephen King. Chapter 1. When I was a kid just starting to feel the chill of deeper waters, my father dropped a piece of advice on me. Like a stone in still water, the ripples are still moving out. "Nick," he said, his voice cutting through the fog of an early morning. "Before you go judging people, remember not everyone's had your chances." He didn't say anything more on it, but that's how it was with us. Words were often scarce, yet we always seemed to say enough. I got his meaning. It was loaded, like a gun on the mantel. Because of that talk, I learned to hold my tongue and keep my eyes open, which has made me something of a confessor or a magnet for the strange and troubled souls I've met along the way. I became the keeper of secret sorrows and forbidden hopes. At college, this trait pinned an unwelcome badge on me. I was marked as a politician of sorts, a whisperer in dim hallways. I never wanted these secrets. Often I'd pretend to sleep or look away, disinterested, whenever I sensed someone about to unload their heart onto my lap. Young men have a way of spilling their guts in the most dramatic prose, words borrowed from books better left on the shelf, their true fears and desires obscured by pretty lies. Holding back judgments my father had preached was a silent vow to keep hope alive. I've tried to live up to that, though I sometimes worry what I might miss if I turn away too often. My father believed, and somehow passed that belief to me, like a cursed heirloom, that decency isn't doled out fairly at birth. I carry that thought, heavy as it is, always wary of what ghosts I might stir up with a few careless words. The shadows of my family have long stretched over the landscapes of the Midwest, where the whispers of the Carraways have been as much a part of the land as the soil itself. My ancestors settled in this heartland with secrets heavy in their pockets, secrets that turned the fertile ground strange and twisted the wheat fields into bizarre, whispering shapes. The legend of our wealth was as deeply rooted as the ancient oaks around our estate, but so too were the tales of misfortune that seemed to follow the Carraways like a persistent fog. The founder of my line was my great-grandfather, a man of considerable esteem, but also of considerable dread. It was said he had made a pact, one born of desperation in the darkest days of winter, when the land was barren and his family starved. The pact brought wealth and prosperity, but with it came a curse that trickled down through the generations, tainting each with an unspoken darkness. This legacy was often discussed in hushed tones at family gatherings, under the dim glow of candlelight, which seemed incapable of pushing back the encroaching shadows. My father, a solemn man, carried the burden of our legacy with a silent stoicism that often bordered on despair. His eyes, when they caught mine, hinted at a deeper sorrow, a warning perhaps, which I could never fully grasp. "Nick, remember who you are," he would say, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard by unseen listeners. The blood of the Carraways runs in your veins, thick with both fortune and misfortune. It was perhaps this very curse that drove me east after the war, following a lineage of Carraways who had ventured toward the rising sun in search of escape from the past. Yet, the past is not so easily left behind, and the whispers of the land did not cease their murmuring at the edges of the Mississippi. They followed me, echoed in the click-clack of train tracks and the lonely wails of distant whistles. I arrived in New York under the guise of seeking prosperity in the bond business, a respectable endeavor far removed from the agricultural curses of my forebears. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I was called here by forces beyond my understanding, drawn to a place where the shadows could be lost in the myriad lights and the incessant cacophony of the city. The house in West Egg then became not just a home, but a sanctuary, a place where I might hide from the ancestral specters that haunted my family. Yet, as I quickly learned, one does not simply hide from a curse. One must confront it, understand it, and perhaps learn to live with it. That first summer, as I watched from my haunted refuge, the green light at the end of Daisy's dock seemed almost a beacon, a lodestar guiding me toward an inexorable destiny tied up with the enigmatic figure of J. Gatsby. It was as if the fates themselves had conspired to draw me into Gatsby's orbit, where the past was not a thing one could run from, but rather something one must face in the glaring light of truth and the deep shadows it casts. The drive to East Egg was one shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to press against the windows of my little roadster, creeping into the crevices of the car like a living thing, as if trying to whisper warnings into my ear. As I neared the Buchanan's mansion, the fog began to lift, but the clarity it brought was no comfort. The house loomed ominously on its sprawling grounds, a stark white palace that seemed too pristine, too perfect, as if hiding its true face behind a mask of architectural beauty. As I pulled up the driveway, the gravel crunched under the tires with a harshness that echoed too loudly in the quiet afternoon. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a lingering note of forewarning. The mansion's windows reflected the sun in such a way that they appeared like blind eyes, watching yet revealing nothing. It gave the impression of being watched by unseen observers, hidden behind the curtains of wealth and privilege. I stepped out, the air heavy with an unseasonable chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The front door was open, as if expecting me, or perhaps it was never quite closed, to let out the secrets that the house couldn't contain. Tom Buchanan greeted me on the porch, his figure a stark silhouette against the blinding light pouring from inside. His voice was jovial, but it carried an edge, like a thinly veiled threat, or perhaps a challenge. "Nick, just in time for an afternoon of leisure," Tom declared, his arms slapping around my shoulders with a weight that felt oddly oppressive. As we entered the hall, a cold draft swept through, as if the house itself was sighing. The interior was lavish, each room more intimidating than the last, filled with ornate decorations that cast grotesque shadows against the walls, making the faces in the old paintings smirk sinisterly as we passed. It felt as though the eyes of the ancestors followed my every move, their gazes piercing through the veil of time with accusatory stares. Daisy appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her voice floating down to greet me, light and melodic, but with a tremor that hinted at hidden depths of sorrow. Her descent was graceful, yet each step seemed measured, overly deliberate, as if she were walking not just down a staircase, but also along a precarious edge of a much darker, deeper abyss. "Nick, you finally come to see me," she said, her smile bright but her eyes shadowed, as though she was fighting back a darkness that threatened to spill out. The drawing room where we gathered was oppressively warm, the fireplace ablaze as if to ward off more than just the physical chill. The windows were flung wide open, but no amount of fresh air could seem to cleanse the atmosphere, thick with a tension that felt almost tangible. As we sat, the curtains billowed as though breathing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was indeed entering, or perhaps had never left. Tom's voice broke through my reverie, pulling me back with a jolt to the present conversation. Yet, every word spoken seemed to echo slightly off-key, as if the house itself was listening, and in its listening, altering the very sound of our voices. As Daisy and Tom bantered back and forth, their laughter too loud, there were moments when Daisy's gaze drifted to the windows, to the green light at the dock across the bay. In those moments, her expression morphed into one of longing, of desperation, as though she were seeing not the light itself, but a beacon from another world, calling her to a place where laughter was not a mask, but a memory. The afternoon waned, and the shadows grew longer, more daring in their creeping. The house seemed to settle around us with the weight of an unspoken truth, pressing down until the very air felt as though it might at any moment shatter like glass. Leaving later, the image of Daisy standing by the window, her figure ghostly in the twilight, haunted me as I drove back to West Egg, the mansion receding in the rearview mirror like a bad dream. Yet, the nightmare I feared was just beginning. As the dinner commenced under the ornate chandelier of the Buchanan's dining hall, the light flickered intermittently, casting long, sinuous shadows across the polished surfaces and our faces. The conversation swirled with the robust aroma of roasted meat and the sharp tang of wine, but beneath the veneer of joviality, there lurked an unease that seemed almost palpable. Every clink of cutlery sounded too loud, too final, as if each bite were counting down to an inevitable disclosure. Tom, expansive in his element, dominated the conversation, his voice booming unnaturally in the corners of the room, which seemed to absorb and then strangely muffle the sound. Daisy's laughter floated across the table, ethereal and slightly off-key, occasionally syncing oddly with the strange acoustics of the room. It was during one of these moments, as the conversation turned to the people of East and West Egg, that the mention of Gatsby first emerged. "Oh, Nick lives next door to Gatsby," Daisy said, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and an inexplicable dread. "Gatsby?" Tom's tone shifted, his eyes narrowing just slightly, enough to send a chill down my spine. "What Gatsby?" There was something in the way he asked, something that suggested not curiosity, but a darker, deeper suspicion, as if the name itself had invoked a specter at the table. A brief, oppressive silence fell, and it felt as though the air itself was waiting, holding its breath along with us. "He's the man who throws those wild parties," I ventured, trying to dissipate the sudden tension. "I haven't met him yet." The conversation stumbled forward awkwardly from there, but the mood had undeniably changed. The mention of Gatsby seemed to have conjured an invisible presence that now sat among us, sipping from the glasses, its breath a cold patch in the warm room. As dinner progressed, the topics drifted to safer shores, but there were moments when I caught Daisy glancing towards the window, her expression haunted, as if she could see something out there, or perhaps someone, observing us from the darkness. The wind picked up, and a branch scraped against the window with a sound like fingernails on glass, causing Daisy to flinch visibly. At one point, the conversation veered into the recent news, and Tom, with his characteristic bravado, began to expound on some book he had read by Goddard. "It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved," Tom asserted, his cheeks flushed with the fervor of his convictions, and perhaps too much wine. "This idea that the races are destined to struggle, that the superior ones will eventually dominate." There was something ominous in his tone, a resonance that felt almost prophetic, and it left an unpleasant echo in the room, like the aftertaste of something bitter. As he spoke, a gust of wind rattled the windows and the lights flickered more aggressively as if in protest. "I love to see you at my table, Nick," Daisy suddenly interjected, her voice overly bright, desperate to change the subject. "You remind me of a rose. An absolute rose." Her attempt at lightness felt strained, and in the flickering candlelight, her smile looked more like a grimace. As the evening wore on, the house seemed to settle deeper into its foundations, groaning under the weight of the unspoken and the unspeakable. By the time I left, the image of Gatsby's mansion, illuminated and pulsing with the ghosts of music and laughter, flashed into my mind unbidden. It struck me then, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, that whatever specters haunted the Buchanans were intrinsically linked to the enigmatic Mr. Gatsby, and I was, somehow, caught in the web of their making. As I drove back to West Egg, the sense of foreboding that clung to me was as palpable as the fog that rolled in off the Sound, shrouding everything in its obscuring embrace. The drive back to West Egg was shrouded in a mist that seemed to rise from the very soul of the earth, enveloping my roadster in a ghostly embrace as it wound its way through the darkened landscape. The evening at the Buchanans had left a peculiar chill in my bones, a residue of unease that no amount of dashboard heating could dispel. Each turn of the road seemed to mirror the twisted turns of the conversation earlier, each shadow thrown by the headlights a dark echo of Tom's veiled threats and Daisy's haunted looks. As I approached the vicinity of Gatsby's mansion, the mist thickened, coiling around the gates like spectral fingers. There was an otherworldliness to the scene that night, as if the boundary between the natural and the supernatural had thinned, blurred by the secrets whispered and withheld behind the Buchanans' opulent doors. I slowed as I passed by Gatsby's property, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The mansion loomed out of the fog, its windows aglow with a phosphorescent light that seemed too stark, too vibrant against the oppressive gloom. I pulled over, my gaze fixed on the distant green light at the end of Daisy's dock, now obscured occasionally by the swirling mists that played over the surface of the Sound. It was then I saw him, or what I presumed was him, Gatsby, standing at the edge of his lawn. His figure was silhouetted against the ghostly light, immobile, as if carved from the very night itself. Compelled by a force I couldn't understand, I stepped out of the car, my feet carrying me towards the shadowy figure on the shore. As I drew closer, the air grew inexplicably colder, the mist swirling more urgently around my legs as if trying to halt my progress. Gatsby seemed to be gazing out over the water, his posture one of desperate longing, or perhaps deep mourning. I stopped a few paces behind him, hesitant to intrude upon his solitude or to break the spell of his vigil. "Mr. Gatsby," I called softly, unsure whether I wanted him to respond. He turned slowly, and as he did, the mist seemed to cling to him, reluctant to let go. His face was obscured by the fog, his features blurred as if he was not fully there, not fully real. Yet there was an intensity in his eyes that burned through the veil of mist, a profound sadness mingled with something wild, something haunted. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The sound of the waves against the shore whispered secrets I couldn't quite grasp, tales of love lost and found, of lives intertwined with the inevitable tragedies they couldn't escape. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned back towards the water, dismissing me without a word, dissolving into the fog as if he had never been there at all. I was left standing, chilled and more alone than I had ever felt, staring out at the green light that flickered like a beacon for all the lost souls of the world. As I walked back to my car, the air seemed to press in on me, heavy with the scent of salt and something else, something like sorrow or forewarning. I drove the last stretch home with the feeling of a story beginning, a story that was as much mine as it was Gatsby's, woven from the threads of dark destinies and the ghosts that danced just beyond the reach of the living. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the eerie call of the foghorn over the water, the image of Gatsby's haunted eyes lingered in my mind, and I knew, somehow, that the summer would bring answers to questions I hadn't yet thought to ask. The shadows whispered around the corners of my room, and in them I heard the soft, insistent murmur of something approaching, something inevitable and maybe, in its own way, terrifying. Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the road takes a sudden dip into a bleak, desolate stretch of land known to the locals as the Valley of Ashes. It's a place where dreams go to die, a wasteland where the ashes of industry settle over everything, suffocating it in a gray shroud. It's as if the land itself has given up, resigned to a fate of perpetual decay. This is no ordinary valley. It is a ghostly place, haunting in its stillness. The landscape is littered with the remnants of human ambition, now turned to dust. The factories, once bustling with life, stand as skeletal sentinels, their windows dark and empty like the eyes of the damned. A fine layer of ash coats the ground, muting all sound and movement, as if the very air is too thick with despair to carry even a whisper. Towering over this grim scene, casting a long, eerie shadow, are the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. They stare out from an old, weather-beaten billboard, two giant spectacles gazing unblinkingly at the world below. The paint is peeling, giving the eyes a hollow, spectral look, as if they see through to the very soul of the Valley of Ashes. These eyes are more than just an advertisement. They are a silent watcher, an omnipresent force that sees everything yet says nothing. They are the eyes of a god forgotten by time, left to watch over the ashes of humanity's broken dreams. There is something deeply unsettling about them, something that chills the blood. It is as if they know the secrets of all who pass beneath their gaze, judging silently from their lofty perch. As I stood there looking up at those unblinking eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The Valley of Ashes was not just a place. It was a purgatory, a grim reminder of the cost of ambition and the inevitability of decay. And in the heart of this desolation, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg watched, eternal and all-seeing, their silent judgment hanging heavy in the air. The road through the valley stretched on, a ribbon of black cutting through the gray. The few people who ventured here moved like shadows, their faces ashen, their eyes hollow. It was a place that seemed to drain the life out of everything it touched, leaving only ghosts and memories in its wake. As I drove on, the sense of unease grew stronger, the weight of the valley pressing down on me. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg followed, relentless in their observation, a haunting reminder that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, could escape their gaze. In this desolate place, the line between the living and the dead seemed thin, and the air was thick with the whispers of the past. It was a valley of lost souls, and the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg were its silent, eternal guardians. The train slowed to a halt at a dismal station, barely more than a decrepit shack at the edge of the Valley of Ashes. Tom Buchanan nudged me out of the car with a grunt, his impatience palpable. The ash-covered platform seemed to creak under our weight, the oppressive silence of the valley pressing in around us. The air was thick with the scent of coal and decay, a stark contrast to the opulence of West Egg. We walked a short distance to a row of dilapidated garages, their doors sagging like the jowls of an old dog. Tom's pace quickened as we approached one particular garage, a building so nondescript it seemed to blend into the very fabric of the valley's desolation. The only sign of life was a single bulb hanging by a thread, flickering weakly as if it might give up the ghost at any moment. Inside, the garage was dimly lit and filled with the acrid smell of gasoline and oil. A heavy-set woman with a sensuous air moved about with a feline grace, her dark eyes flicking up as we entered. Myrtle Wilson, Tom's mistress, was a stark contrast to her surroundings. Her vibrant dress and heavy makeup seemed almost garish against the backdrop of grime and neglect. Yet there was something about her, a raw vitality that seemed out of place in this land of shadows. "Myrtle," Tom called, his voice rough and commanding. She turned, a slow smile spreading across her face as she saw him. There was a dangerous glint in her eye, a predatory gleam that set my nerves on edge. She moved towards us with a languid, almost serpentine grace, her eyes never leaving Tom's. "Tom," she purred, her voice a low, throaty whisper. "I've been waiting." Tom introduced me curtly, and her gaze flicked to me, appraising, calculating. There was an intensity to her scrutiny, as if she were sizing me up for some unknown purpose. The sense of menace was palpable, a dark undercurrent that seemed to seep into the very walls of the garage. Tom and Myrtle exchanged a few words, their voices low and conspiratorial. I stood awkwardly, feeling like an intruder in this tableau of forbidden desire. The tension between them was electric, charged with a dangerous energy that made the air hum. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a primal warning of unseen danger. "We're going to the city," Tom announced suddenly, breaking the spell. Myrtle's eyes lit up with excitement, and she moved to fetch her things. As she turned away, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the grimy mirror on the wall. For a moment it seemed as though her eyes had turned cold, calculating, a predator sizing up its prey. The ride to New York was tense, the silence in the car heavy and oppressive. Tom and Myrtle exchanged occasional glances, their expressions unreadable. The city loomed ahead, a beacon of light and noise in the darkness, but even its bright lights could not dispel the shadow that had settled over us. As we arrived at the apartment Tom kept for their illicit meetings, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The building was old, its once grand facade now crumbling and covered in a thick layer of grime. The elevator ride up was claustrophobic, the air stale and thick with the scent of forgotten things. Inside, the apartment was a stark contrast to the valley and the garage, filled with gaudy decorations and heavy, oppressive furniture. Myrtle moved about the space with a confidence that belied the tension in the air, pouring drinks and chatting animatedly. But beneath her cheerful exterior, there was an edge, a sharpness that spoke of something darker lurking just below the surface. Tom watched her with a possessive intensity, his eyes following her every move. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, a mixture of desire and control that made my skin crawl. As the night wore on, the sense of unease deepened, the shadows in the room lengthening, growing darker and more oppressive. The evening was a blur of alcohol and strained conversation, the laughter brittle and forced. Tom and Myrtle's interactions were charged with a dangerous energy, a volatile mix of passion and power that threatened to explode at any moment. I felt like a spectator at a macabre dance, the sense of impending doom hanging heavy in the air. And through it all, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg haunted my thoughts, their silent judgment a reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of this world. The night ended with a sense of unfinished business, a lingering dread that followed me back to the relative safety of West Egg. As I lay in bed that night, the shadows seemed to whisper around me, the echoes of the day's events replaying in my mind. The Valley of Ashes, the menacing presence of Myrtle, and the ever-watchful eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. All these things combined to create a sense of foreboding that I could not shake. It was as if the darkness of the valley had seeped into my very soul, a reminder that not all shadows can be dispelled by the light of day. The journey to New York City began uneventfully enough, but there was an unspoken tension that clung to us like the ash from the valley. We piled into Tom's car, Myrtle's eyes gleaming with excitement and something darker, more predatory. The engine roared to life, a beast awakened, and we sped away from the desolate valley toward the city that promised both escape and danger. As we drove, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows began to lengthen, creeping across the landscape like grasping fingers. The road ahead seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic, the familiar route taking on a sinister quality in the dimming light. I glanced at Tom, whose jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that suggested he was not entirely in control of our path. Myrtle sat beside him, her laughter sharp and brittle, cutting through the oppressive silence. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the seat, white-knuckled and trembling. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen, something inevitable and terrible. As the city lights began to shimmer in the distance, the car's headlights flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the road ahead. The radio, previously silent, crackled to life, emitting a low, eerie hum that set my teeth on edge. Tom cursed under his breath and fiddled with the dial, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Damned thing," he muttered, smacking the dashboard with his palm. The hum shifted, warping into a disjointed melody that seemed to echo from some distant, forgotten place. Myrtle's laughter faltered, and she glanced at Tom, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear. The road stretched on, endless and dark, and the hum from the radio seemed to seep into my bones, a low, resonant vibration that unsettled me to my core. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, a primal warning that something was terribly wrong. The city, once a beacon of light and life, now loomed ahead like a monstrous silhouette, its skyscrapers jagged and menacing against the night sky. Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. The car's headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside, its features obscured by the darkness. As we sped past, I caught a glimpse of hollow eyes staring back at us, empty and unseeing, a reflection of the valley we had left behind. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Myrtle shivered, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "See what?" Tom's voice was sharp, defensive. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "That man, by the side of the road," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "There was no man," Tom said, his tone final, brooking no argument. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory of those hollow eyes lingered, a specter that refused to be dismissed. The city drew closer, its lights flickering like the dying embers of a fire. The hum from the radio grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to drown out all other sound. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and I glanced at Myrtle, whose eyes were now fixed on the dashboard, her expression unreadable. The streets of New York were a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, the tall buildings pressing in on us from all sides. We pulled up to the apartment building, its facade crumbling and weathered, a relic of a bygone era. The hum from the radio ceased abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. We stepped out of the car, the night air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. Myrtle led the way, her movements quick and jittery, as if she were being driven by some unseen force. Tom followed, his face a mask of determination and barely concealed rage. Inside the building, the air was stifling, the narrow hallways dimly lit by flickering bulbs. As we climbed the stairs, I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, seeping through the walls. My pulse quickened, the sense of dread growing stronger with each step. At last, we reached the apartment, and Tom unlocked the door with a key that seemed to weigh heavily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in shadows, the furniture draped in dust and neglect. Myrtle moved to light a lamp, but the bulb flickered and died, casting us back into darkness. "Welcome to the city," Tom said, his voice a low growl. He turned to me, his eyes dark and inscrutable. "Let's have a drink." As the night wore on, the shadows in the apartment seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing like restless spirits. The hum from the radio, though silenced, seemed to linger in the air, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at play. Myrtle's laughter rang hollow, a brittle facade that could shatter at any moment. And through it all, the memory of those hollow eyes by the roadside haunted me, a reminder that in the city, as in the valley, the past could never truly be left behind. The New York City apartment, dimly lit and oppressively silent, seemed to swallow us whole as we stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of stale smoke and spilled liquor, a pungent reminder of countless forgotten nights. The apartment was a warren of small, cramped rooms, each one filled with gaudy furniture that had seen better days. Heavy drapes hung at the windows, blocking out the city's restless lights and casting everything in a murky gloom. Myrtle moved about the space with a frenetic energy, her laugh brittle and forced as she poured drinks and set out trays of dubious-looking hors d'oeuvre. Tom watched her with a predatory intensity, his eyes glinting in the half-light. The atmosphere was charged with a dangerous energy, a volatile mix of desire and disdain that seemed to seep into the very walls. Other guests began to arrive, each one more disheveled and desperate than the last. They stumbled into the apartment like moths drawn to a flame, their eyes hollow and their smiles fixed in place. The room filled quickly, the noise rising to a dull roar that seemed to press in on me from all sides. The conversations were loud and brash, filled with boasts and half-truths, the laughter tinged with an edge of hysteria. I found myself wedged into a corner, nursing a drink that tasted of regret and cheap gin. The air grew thicker, the room smaller, the shadows darker. I could feel the weight of the apartment pressing down on me, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. The laughter around me took on a manic quality, a sharp, brittle sound that seemed to echo off the walls. Tom and Myrtle were at the center of it all, their interactions a grotesque dance of power and submission. Tom's hand gripped Myrtle's arm with a bruising force, his eyes dark with something that looked very much like hatred. Myrtle's laugh grew louder, more shrill, as if she were daring him to break her. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, a dangerous current that threatened to spark at any moment. "Let's have some fun," Tom declared, his voice cutting through the din. He reached for the radio, turning the dial until a raucous jazz tune filled the room. The music was too loud, too insistent, a frenzied beat that set my teeth on edge. The guests responded with an almost desperate eagerness, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as they swayed and stumbled to the music. Myrtle danced with wild abandon, her dress clinging to her sweat-slicked skin. She threw her head back, laughing, but there was no joy in the sound. It was a laugh that spoke of desperation, of a soul teetering on the edge of an abyss. Tom watched her, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark and unreadable. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pulsing with the beat of the music, the shadows flickering like wraiths. I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with the scent of alcohol and despair, a heady mix that made my stomach churn. As the night wore on, the conversations grew darker, the laughter more frenzied. The guests' eyes glittered with a kind of manic intensity, their movements becoming more erratic. It was as if the apartment itself was feeding off their debauchery, growing darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. I caught snippets of conversation, fragments that hinted at secrets and sins. One man boasted of a fortune made and lost, his voice slurred and bitter. A woman laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Tom and Myrtle's interactions grew more heated, their voices rising in a crescendo of accusation and denial. And through it all, I felt the presence of something unseen, something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight. It was a feeling that crawled under my skin, a sense of being watched by eyes that saw too much. The apartment was alive with shadows, the walls whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. Tom's hand struck Myrtle with a sudden brutal force, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. She staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. The room fell silent, the guests frozen in a tableau of horror and fascination. Tom stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a terrible fury. Myrtle's laughter shattered the silence, a high, hysterical sound that sent a shiver down my spine. She rose to her feet, her eyes flashing with defiance, her smile twisted and grotesque. The room erupted into chaos, the guests shouting and pushing, the shadows dancing wildly in the flickering light. I stumbled out of the apartment, the noise and the heat and the darkness pressing in on me. The air outside was cold and sharp, a welcome relief from the claustrophobic horror of the apartment. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The image of Tom and Myrtle burned into my mind. As I walked away from the building, I felt the weight of the night's events settle over me like a shroud. The city around me was alive with light and noise, but all I could hear were the echoes of that brittle laughter, the whispered secrets, the shadows whispering in the darkness, It was a night that would haunt me, a reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of this glittering world. The night had grown late, the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment thickening into something almost tangible. The guests had descended into a stupor, their laughter now hollow and broken, their conversations mere murmurs lost in the haze of smoke and despair. The air was electric with tension, an undercurrent of danger that thrummed just beneath the surface. Tom, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, stood in the center of the room, his eyes locked on Myrtle. She met his gaze with a defiant glint, her laughter a brittle shield against the storm she knew was coming. The other guests sensed the impending explosion and began to edge away, their eyes darting nervously between the two. "Myrtle," Tom growled, his voice low and menacing. "I've had enough of your games." Myrtle's smile widened, a twisted parody of joy. "Oh, Tom," she taunted, her voice dripping with mockery. "Is the big man getting tired?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the shadows deepening as if drawn to the darkness in Tom's eyes. He took a step forward, his hand curling into a fist at his side. The guests watched, transfixed, as if witnessing a predator stalking its prey. "You think you can make a fool out of me?" Tom's voice was a dangerous whisper, each word laced with venom. Myrtle's laughter rang out, high and shrill. "You do a fine job of that yourself, Tom," she spat, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and fury. In an instant, Tom's hand shot out, striking Myrtle across the face with a brutal force. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, a crack that seemed to split the very air. Myrtle staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. The room erupted into chaos, the guests shouting and scrambling to get out of the way. Tom advanced on Myrtle, his face a mask of uncontrollable rage. She backed away, her defiance crumbling into terror, her laughter replaced by a choked sob. "You don't know when to keep your mouth shut," Tom snarled, his voice a guttural growl. He grabbed Myrtle by the arm, his grip like a vice, and dragged her toward the door. "Tom, please!" Myrtle pleaded, her voice trembling. "Let go, you're hurting me!" But Tom was beyond reason, consumed by a dark fury that seemed to pulse through him, a force of nature unleashed. He threw her against the wall, her head striking the plaster with a sickening thud. The room went silent, the only sound the ragged breaths of the onlookers and the low hum of the city beyond. Myrtle crumpled to the floor, her body limp and lifeless. Tom stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and something else, something darker, more primal. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the room growing colder, the very air thick with the scent of blood and fear. "Get out!" Tom barked at the remaining guests, his voice rough and commanding. "All of you, get out!" The guests needed no further prompting. They fled the apartment, their footsteps echoing down the narrow hallways, leaving behind a scene of destruction and despair. I lingered for a moment, transfixed by the sight of Myrtle's broken form, the blood pooling beneath her head, a stark reminder of the night's brutality. As I finally turned to leave, the apartment seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But the sense of foreboding remained, a chilling whisper of the dark forces that had been unleashed. The city outside was alive with light and noise, but within the walls of that apartment, a shadow had been cast that would not easily be dispelled. I walked away from the building, the cold night air biting at my skin. The memory of Myrtle's lifeless eyes burned into my mind. The events of the night played over and over in my thoughts, a grim reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of our lives. As I reached West Egg, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The green light at the end of Daisy's dock flickered in the distance, a beacon of lost dreams and unattainable desires. And behind it all, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg watched, silent and all-seeing, a reminder that no secret could remain hidden forever. The night's events had left a mark, a darkness that would haunt me and all who had witnessed it. There was no escaping the shadows that had been cast, no turning back from the path we had chosen. The Valley of Ashes was not just a place. It was a state of being, a constant reminder of the cost of ambition and the inevitability of decay. As I lay in bed that morning, the shadows seemed to whisper around me, the echoes of the night's horrors refusing to be silenced. It was a night that had changed everything, a night that had revealed the true darkness within us all. And as the dawn broke, I knew that the events of that night were only the beginning, the first stirrings of a storm that would consume us all. Chapter 3. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. But this was no ordinary garden, and these were no ordinary gatherings. The air seemed charged with a strange energy, as if the very fabric of reality had thinned, allowing something otherworldly to seep through. Every Friday night, a spectral glow emanated from Gatsby's mansion, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawns. The house itself loomed like a ghostly palace, its windows flickering with an unnatural light. It was as if the mansion had a life of its own, breathing and pulsing with a dark vitality that both fascinated and repelled. As dusk settled, a procession of luxury cars began to arrive, their headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness like spectral beacons. The guests emerged, their laughter high and brittle, their faces masked in an almost desperate gaiety. They were drawn to the mansion like moths to a flame, compelled by an irresistible force that none could fully understand. The gardens were filled with music that seemed to echo from another realm, a haunting melody that wove its way through the trees and over the shimmering pools. The flowers, in full bloom, exuded a heady fragrance that mingled with the scent of decay, a subtle reminder that beauty and rot were often intertwined. Waiters glided silently among the guests, their faces pale and expressionless, as if they were specters themselves. They carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre, offering sustenance that seemed both sumptuous and sinister. The food and drink had an almost hypnotic allure, drawing the guests deeper into the night's revelries. As the night wore on, the line between reality and fantasy blurred. The guests, caught in the spell of the music and the lights, danced with an abandon that bordered on the maniacal. Their movements were frenzied, their laughter echoing through the gardens like the cries of lost souls. It was as if the very essence of the party had taken hold of them, transforming them into creatures of the night, bound to the mansion's dark magic. And at the center of it all was Gatsby, a shadowy figure whose presence was felt even when he was not seen. He moved through the party like a phantom, his eyes watchful and knowing. There was something about him, an air of mystery and power that set him apart from the rest. It was as if he were the master of some grand, dark enchantment, his wealth and influence woven from the very threads of the night. Rumors swirled around him, whispered tales of fantastic wealth and shadowy dealings. Some said he had made a pact with forces beyond this world, trading his soul for the opulence and grandeur that surrounded him. Others claimed he was a magician, his parties a grand illusion designed to ensnare the unwary. But no one knew for certain, and it was this uncertainty that added to his allure. As I stood at the edge of the garden, watching the spectacle unfold, I felt a chill run down my spine. The night was alive with whispers and shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something beyond my comprehension. Gatsby's parties were not just gatherings. They were rituals, rites of passage into a world where reality and fantasy were entwined in a dark, seductive dance. The mansion loomed above me, its windows glowing with a light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And as the night deepened, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, a silent warning that behind the opulence and glamour lay something far more sinister. It was a world of enchantment and dread, and I couldn't help but feel that once drawn in, there would be no escape. Gatsby's parties were a siren song, a call to a dark revelry that promised both ecstasy and terror. And in the heart of it all was Gatsby himself, the enigmatic master of this spectral domain. The days passed in a haze of summer heat, and the ever-present hum of cicadas. The opulence of Gatsby's parties continued to spill over the walls of his mansion, a constant reminder of the mysterious figure who lived just next door. Despite the extravagant displays of wealth and the ceaseless flow of guests, I had never once seen the man himself. Then, one evening, a strange envelope arrived at my door. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind that whispers secrets when touched. My name was written in an elegant, looping script that seemed almost to writhe on the page, alive with a hidden energy. Inside, a single card lay nestled in a bed of dark, crimson velvet. The invitation was simple, yet the words seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. "You are cordially invited to a party at J. Gatsby's mansion." The date and time followed, but it was the signature at the bottom that held my gaze. J. Gatsby. The letters seemed to pulse, as if they held a life of their own, a silent promise of the mysteries to be unveiled. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an invitation. It was a summons. The sense of foreboding grew stronger as the evening approached, a heavy weight that settled in my chest. When the night of the party finally arrived, I dressed with a sense of apprehension, my movements slow and deliberate. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence outside my window oppressive. As I stepped out of my house, the path to Gatsby's mansion seemed to stretch out before me, longer and darker than I remembered. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows ablaze with light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the lawn. The sound of music floated through the air, a haunting melody that seemed to echo from another world. The guests, dressed in their finest, moved like phantoms among the trees, their laughter a brittle, hollow sound. I approached the grand entrance, the massive doors standing open as if inviting me into the heart of the darkness. A butler, pale and silent, handed me a drink without a word, his eyes cold and distant. The liquid in the glass shimmered with an unnatural iridescence, and I hesitated before taking a sip. The foyer was a cavernous space, filled with shadows that seemed to flicker and move of their own accord. The air was heavy with the scent of exotic flowers and something else, something metallic and sharp. The sense of unease grew stronger, a palpable force that pressed in from all sides. As I made my way through the throng of guests, I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, watching my every move. The laughter around me was too loud, too forced, the conversations filled with an undercurrent of desperation. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, feeding off the energy of the party, growing stronger with each passing moment. I wandered through the labyrinthine corridors, each room more opulent and disorienting than the last. The guests moved with a strange, dreamlike quality, their faces blurred and indistinct. The music, once lively and invigorating, now seemed to take on a darker tone, a sinister edge that set my teeth on edge. In one of the rooms, I found myself standing before a grand mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something off, something wrong. The eyes that met mine were not my own. They were darker, colder, filled with the knowledge that I could not comprehend. A sudden noise broke the spell, and I turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see straight through me. He smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth, only a promise of secrets yet to be revealed. "Welcome to my home," he said, his voice smooth and melodic, yet carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "I am J. Gatsby." His presence was magnetic, a force that drew me in even as it filled me with a sense of dread. There was something about him, something otherworldly, that set him apart from the other guests. He moved with an almost predatory grace, his eyes never leaving mine. "Thank you for the invitation," I managed to say, my voice sounding small and distant in the vastness of the room. Gatsby's smile widened, and he stepped closer, his gaze intense. "I've been looking forward to meeting you, Nick. There is much we need to discuss." The word sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the weight of the mansion pressing in around me, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. Gatsby extended his hand, and I took it, feeling a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. As he led me through the winding corridors, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, the darkness deeper. It was as if the mansion itself were alive, its very walls whispering secrets, its floors creaking with the weight of countless untold stories. And at the heart of it all was Gatsby, the enigmatic master of this dark domain, his eyes filled with a knowledge that I could not fathom. The night stretched out before me, filled with the promise of revelations and the threat of unseen dangers. In the flickering candlelight, Gatsby's shadow loomed large, a specter that seemed to dance on the edge of my vision. And as the music swelled and the laughter echoed through the halls, I knew that I had stepped into a world far darker and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. The grand ballroom was a cacophony of music and laughter, a dizzying swirl of colors and lights that seemed almost hypnotic. I moved through the crowd, my senses overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of it all. The guests, dressed in their finest, danced and laughed with a frenetic energy that bordered on the manic. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, their smiles too wide, their laughter too loud. As I wandered through the throng, snippets of conversation reached my ears, each one adding to the growing sense of unease. The rumors about Gatsby were as varied as they were outlandish, each one more fantastical than the last. "I heard he once killed a man," whispered a woman in a glittering dress, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Nonsense," scoffed her companion, a man with a sharp, angular face. "He's a war hero, decorated for bravery, but they say he came back. Different." A shiver ran down my spine as I listened, the words painting a picture of a man both extraordinary and terrifying. The air around me seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as I moved further into the room. Another group of guests caught my attention, their voices low and conspiratorial. "He's into some dark business," one man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Deals with the occult, they say. That's how he got his fortune." The words hung in the air, a sinister promise of things unseen. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my heart pounding in my chest. The music, once lively and invigorating, now seemed to take on a discordant, almost malevolent tone. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in around me, the weight of the whispers and secrets pressing down on my shoulders. I drifted from group to group, each conversation more unsettling than the last. "I heard he made a pact with the devil," murmured an elderly woman, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "That's why he never seems to age." "He's a phantom," declared a young man with a wild look in his eyes. "I've seen him disappear right in front of my eyes. One moment he's there, the next, gone." The sense of dread grew stronger, the shadows darker. It was as if Gatsby's mansion was a living entity, feeding off the fear and speculation of its inhabitants. The guests moved like specters, their faces blurred and indistinct in the flickering candlelight. The air was heavy with the scent of perfume and decay, a heady mix that made my stomach churn. As I stood near the edge of the dance floor, a young woman in a pale, shimmering dress approached me. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her smile too fixed, too strained. "You're Nick Carraway, aren't you?" she asked, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Yes, I am." She leaned in closer, her breath cold against my skin. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's not what it seems. Gatsby, he's not what he seems." Before I could respond, she melted back into the crowd, her words lingering in my mind like a dark omen. The room seemed to tilt and sway, the walls closing in, the shadows lengthening. I felt a growing sense of unease, a nagging fear that something terrible was lurking just out of sight. The guests continued their revelry, oblivious to the dark undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface. Their laughter echoed off the walls, a hollow, brittle sound that seemed to grow louder, more frantic. It was as if they were trying to drown out the whispers, the secrets that threatened to consume them. I moved through the mansion, each room more disorienting and unsettling than the last. The faces of the guests blurred together, their voices a cacophony of rumors and speculations. The sense of mystery and danger grew stronger, an almost palpable force that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the mansion. As I passed by a group of guests gathered near a grand, ornate mirror, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. For a moment it seemed distorted, twisted, the eyes staring back at me filled with a dark, knowing gleam. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by my own familiar features. But the sense of unease lingered, a cold, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. The rumors about Gatsby swirled around me, a dark, tangled web of half-truths and whispers. Each new revelation added to the growing sense of dread, the feeling that I had stepped into a world where reality and nightmare were indistinguishable. As the night wore on, the shadows grew deeper, the air colder. The guests' laughter took on a frenzied, desperate edge, their movements more erratic. It was as if the very essence of the party had shifted, revealing the dark, sinister heart that lay beneath the glittering surface. And through it all, the figure of Gatsby loomed large, a specter that seemed to watch from the shadows, his eyes filled with secrets and promises of darkness. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, a silent warning that I was only beginning to understand the true nature of the man and the world he had created. As I stood at the edge of the ballroom, the music swelling to a haunting crescendo, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the shadows held more than just darkness. The mansion seemed to breathe around me, a living, pulsing entity that fed on the fears and desires of its inhabitants. And as the night drew to a close, I knew that the mysteries of Gatsby's world were far darker and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The night was wearing on, and the mansion's grand ballroom had taken on an almost surreal quality. The guests moved through the room like phantoms, their laughter echoing hollowly off the ornate walls. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and something else, something darker and more metallic. The sense of foreboding that had settled over me since my arrival grew stronger with each passing moment. I found myself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching the swirling mass of partygoers with a growing sense of unease. The shadows seemed to flicker and dance just beyond the reach of the chandelier's light, as if hiding secrets too terrible to reveal. It was then that I noticed him, a figure standing apart from the revelry, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his suit a perfect fit that seemed almost too perfect, as if it were a part of him. His eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to see straight through me, and his smile was both charming and disquieting. "Mr. Carroway," he said, his voice smooth and melodic, yet carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're Jay Gatsby," I said, more a statement than a question. He inclined his head slightly, his smile widening. "Indeed I am. Welcome to my home." There was something about him, an air of mystery and power that set him apart from the other guests. He moved with an almost predatory grace, each step deliberate and measured. As he approached, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening around us. "It's quite a party," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Gatsby's eyes sparkled with amusement, but there was a darkness there, a depth that was both fascinating and terrifying. "I'm glad you're enjoying it," he replied. "I throw these gatherings to bring people together, to create a sense of wonder and possibility." As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if his words held a hidden meaning that I couldn't quite grasp. There was an otherworldly quality to him, a sense that he was not entirely of this world. The air around us seemed to thrum with an unseen energy, a palpable force that set my nerves on edge. Gatsby gestured for me to follow him, and we moved through the crowded room. the guests parting before him as if compelled by an invisible hand. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion itself was alive, its very walls watching and listening. We reached a secluded corner of the garden, where the noise of the party was muted, and the air was thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers. Gatsby turned to me, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Do you know why I invited you here tonight, Nick?" he asked, his voice low and resonant. I shook my head, my mouth suddenly dry. "No, I don't." Gatsby's smile was enigmatic, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I have a feeling that you and I are going to be great friends. There's something about you, something different." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of unease. There was a hidden menace in his tone, a suggestion that his interest in me was not entirely benign. The shadows around us seemed to close in, the garden growing darker and more oppressive. "I've heard a lot about you," I said, trying to steer the conversation away from myself. "There are many rumors." Gatsby's smile widened, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "Rumors are like shadows, Nick. They can be distorted and twisted, but they often hold a kernel of truth." The sense of foreboding grew stronger, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. There was a darkness in Gatsby, a hidden depth that both intrigued and terrified me. I had the feeling that he was a man who could see into the very soul of those around him, who could lay bare their darkest secrets with a single glance. "Don't believe everything you hear," Gatsby said, his voice almost a whisper. "People like to make up stories about things they don't understand." As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath my feet was shifting. The garden seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder. Gatsby's presence was overpowering, a magnetic force that drew me in even as it filled me with dread. "I have great plans, Nick," Gatsby continued, his eyes burning with an inner fire, "and I believe you may have a part to play in them." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a chill down my spine. There was a sense of inevitability, a feeling that I had been drawn into something far larger and more dangerous than I could comprehend. Gatsby reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch cold and firm. "We'll speak again soon," he said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Enjoy the party." As he turned and walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But the feeling of unease remained, a gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. I made my way back to the ballroom, the noise and light assaulting my senses. The guests moved around me like wraiths, their laughter echoing hollowly off the walls. The shadows seemed to whisper secrets, the air thick with the scent of decay and roses. And through it all, the figure of Gatsby loomed large, a dark specter that watched from the shadows, his eyes filled with secrets and promises of darkness. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, a silent warning that I had only begun to understand the true nature of the man and the world he had created. As the party began to wind down, the guests drifted away like ghosts, their laughter fading into the night. The mansion, once alive with music and light, now seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, its opulent facade casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. I found myself standing alone near the garden, the cold night air a welcome contrast to the oppressive warmth inside. I made my way back through the grand ballroom, now eerily quiet and deserted. The remnants of the night's revelry lay scattered about, empty champagne glasses, discarded masks, and forgotten shawls, all shrouded in a sense of melancholy decay. The chandeliers above flickered, casting ghostly light across the room, as if the mansion itself were haunted by the memories of the evening. Stepping outside, I was enveloped by the cool darkness of the night. The path to my modest home seemed longer and more foreboding than ever, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape, and the sound of the distant waves crashing against the shore was a constant, unsettling whisper. As I walked, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, now dim and distant, seemed to follow my every move, their silent gaze a reminder of the dark forces at play in this world. The unease that had settled over me during the party grew stronger, a cold, gnawing fear that burrowed deep into my soul. Reaching my house, I paused at the door, glancing back at Gatsby's mansion. The windows, once ablaze with light, were now dark and inscrutable, like the eyes of a slumbering beast. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I turned the key in the lock, the click echoing in the stillness, and stepped inside. The house felt colder than it should have, the shadows lurking in the corners like silent sentinels. I made my way to the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain. Looking out, I saw Gatsby standing at the edge of his dock, his silhouette stark against the backdrop of the night. He was staring out across the bay, towards the distant green light that marked Daisy's home. There was something haunting about his figure, a sense of profound loneliness and unfulfilled longing. The air seemed to thrum with a strange energy, a low, resonant hum that set my teeth on edge. Gatsby stood motionless, a solitary figure in the vast expanse of darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a man, that he was a symbol, a manifestation of some ancient, unknowable force. As I watched, a thick mist began to rise from the water, swirling around Gatsby's feet and slowly enveloping him. The green light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like specters. The mist seemed almost alive, a living entity that moved with a sinister grace, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Gatsby remained still, his gaze fixed on the distant light, his form gradually disappearing into the fog. It was as if he were being claimed by the night, drawn into the depths of some otherworldly realm. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, a palpable force that pressed in around me, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. I backed away from the window, the cold sweat of fear slicking my skin. The house felt suddenly alien, a place where shadows whispered secrets, and the air was thick with unseen dangers. I stumbled to my bed, my mind racing with the night's events. The image of Gatsby's haunted figure burned into my thoughts. As I lay there, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very walls. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and relentless, and I felt the weight of an unseen presence, watching, waiting. Sleep was elusive, the night stretching out into an eternity of fear and unease. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I knew that the events of the night were only the beginning. The world of J. Gatsby was a place where reality and nightmare intertwined, where the past refused to stay buried, and the shadows held secrets too terrible to comprehend. The sense of foreboding lingered, a dark promise of the mysteries and horrors yet to come. In the quiet of the early morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, I felt a chill that went beyond the physical. It was a warning, a silent echo of the night's revelations, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, nothing was as it seemed, and the truth was far more terrifying than any fiction. Chapter 4. On Sunday mornings, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. But these guests were not merely the glittering elite of society. They were a peculiar assortment of individuals, drawn to Gatsby's mansion by forces that seemed to defy simple explanation. The lists of those who attended Gatsby's parties read like a roster of the damned, each name carrying with it an air of mystery and dread. From East Egg came the Chester Beckers and the Leashes, and a man named Bunsen, who was once a high-ranking official but now whispered of in dark corners as someone who trafficked in secrets best left undiscovered. Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine under suspicious circumstances, and the Hornbeams, who had a reputation for dabbling in the occult, their gatherings rumored to summon forces that should never have been awakened. The guests arrived in droves, their faces masked in expressions of forced gaiety, but their eyes held secrets, dark and terrible, that belied their outward appearances. The orchestra played on, their music a haunting echo that seemed to come from the very walls of the mansion, and the laughter of the guests rang hollow, a brittle sound that sent shivers down my spine. From West Egg came the Poles and the Mulreadys and Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Shone, who shared a suspiciously close resemblance, rumored to be the result of dark experiments rather than familial ties. The Fishguards and the Ripley Snells, who arrived with their bodies physically intact, but their spirits fractured by what they had seen in the depths of Gatsby's parties. There was also Mr. Albrucksberger, whose business dealings were shrouded in an unnatural fog of secrecy, and Miss Hogg, who whispered to shadows and was said to have visions of things yet to come. The Chettles and the O.R.P. Schraders, whose fortunes were built on the backs of the forgotten and the damned, and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, who possessed a haunted gaze that seemed to pierce through the veil of the living and the dead. From East Egg came the Blackbucks, who favored Gatsby's glistening party with their presence, their eyes always darting to the dark corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge. The Ismays and the Christies, who never smiled and seemed to carry with them an aura of despair, and Edgar Beaver, whose wealth was said to come from a pact made on a night filled with dark rites and unspeakable promises. The guests mingled and drank, their conversations filled with half-truths and whispered lies. Each name on the list was a story, each story a thread in the dark tapestry of Gatsby's world. Clarence Endive, who came only once in white knickerbockers and left abruptly, never to return, his face pale and drawn, as if he had glimpsed something in the shadows that had sapped his very soul. The guests were an eclectic mix, their lives intertwined with the dark and mysterious forces that seemed to surround Gatsby. They came from all walks of life, but each carried with them a sense of unease, a feeling that they were being drawn into something far larger and more dangerous than they could comprehend. The laughter and music could not mask the underlying tension, the sense that the mansion itself was watching, waiting, feeding off the energy of its occupants. At Gatsby's parties, the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur, and the air was thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. The lists of notable guests were not merely names on a page. They were the embodiment of the dark allure that Gatsby's world held, a world where the past refused to stay buried, and the shadows held 1,000 whispered tales. The summer sun was a blazing disk in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The world outside Gatsby's mansion was bathed in a harsh, almost unforgiving light, yet there was an air of unreality about it, as if the very fabric of the day was frayed and worn. I had just finished breakfast when Gatsby himself appeared at my door. He was immaculate as always, his suit pressed and his smile as enigmatic as ever. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something dark and unreadable that set my nerves on edge. "Good morning, old sport," he greeted me, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone that I couldn't quite place. "Would you like to go for a drive?" The invitation seemed innocuous enough, but there was a weight to his words, a sense of urgency that I found unsettling. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else, and followed him to his car, a sleek, powerful machine that seemed almost alive, its polished surface reflecting the world in distorted, surreal shapes. As we climbed into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into another realm, a place where the rules of reality were bent and twisted. Gatsby took the wheel with a confidence that bordered on the unnatural. As the engine roared to life, the sound was a low, growling hum that resonated deep within my bones. We pulled away from the mansion, the landscape blurring past us in a dizzying rush. The sun's light seemed to waver, casting strange, flickering shadows that danced along the road. Gatsby drove with an intensity that was almost unnerving, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he were chasing something only he could see. The road ahead twisted and turned, the scenery shifting in ways that felt both familiar and alien. I tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were clipped, his focus elsewhere. "Beautiful day," I ventured, trying to break the silence that had settled over us like a shroud. Gatsby nodded, his smile tight. Indeed, old sport. A perfect day for a drive. There was something in his tone, a hint of something unspoken that made my skin prickle. The car's interior felt claustrophobic, the air thick with an unnameable tension. The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder, filling the silence with a throbbing, almost menacing undertone. As we sped along the winding road, Gatsby finally began to speak, his voice low and measured. I suppose you've heard many things about me, Nick. Stories, rumors, tales of who I am and where I come from. I nodded, sensing that he was about to reveal something significant. Yes, I've heard quite a few. Gatsby's eyes flicked towards me, a flicker of amusement mingled with something darker. People like to talk, to weave their own narratives. But the truth, Nick, the truth is often far stranger than fiction. The road seemed to narrow, the trees on either side closing in like silent sentinels. The light filtering through the branches cast eerie patterns on the ground, and I felt a growing sense of unease. Gatsby's words hung in the air, a tantalizing promise of revelations yet to come. I've done many things in my life, Gatsby continued, his gaze returning to the road. Some of them are better left unsaid. But what you must understand, Nick, is that everything I've done for a purpose. There was a weight to his words, a sense of gravity that made my heart pound. The car's speed increased, the world outside becoming a blur of light and shadow. The engine's growl was now a relentless, almost hypnotic drone, and I felt a growing sense of disorientation. Gatsby's smile widened, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. We all have our secrets, Nick. We all have our pasts. But some pasts are darker than others. And some secrets have a way of shaping our destinies. The car rounded a bend, and the road ahead opened up into a long, straight stretch. The landscape on either side was desolate, the horizon shrouded in a haze that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, a palpable force that pressed in around me. As Gatsby spoke, his voice took on a lyrical, almost hypnotic quality. You see, Nick, there are forces in this world that we can scarcely comprehend. Powers that shape our lives in ways we cannot control. I've encountered these forces, danced with them, made bargains and paid prices. And now, I am what you see before you, a man caught between worlds, a master of shadows and light. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath us had shifted. Gatsby's words were like a dark incantation, a spell that wove itself around me, drawing me deeper into his enigmatic world. The car seemed to glide over the road, the landscape shifting and warping in ways that defied logic. And you, Nick, Gatsby said, his gaze locking onto mine. You are now a part of this world, a part of my story. Together, we will uncover truths and face the shadows that linger in the corners of our lives. The words were a dark promise, a binding contract that I couldn't escape. The road stretched out before us, a path shrouded in mystery and danger. The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with the weight of unseen forces. As we drove on, I realized that I had crossed a threshold, stepped into a realm where the ordinary and the supernatural were intertwined. Gatsby's world was a place of shadows and secrets, a landscape where reality and nightmare danced in an uneasy truce. And as the car sped towards an uncertain horizon, I knew that my life would never be the same. The shadows of Gatsby's world had claimed me, and there was no turning back. As the car roared down the desolate road, the landscape around us seemed to twist and warp, the boundaries between reality and illusion growing, increasingly blurred. The sunlight, once bright and harsh, now filtered through a thickening haze, casting an eerie glow over the world. The sense of unease that had settled over me during our drive deepened, a palpable weight that pressed down on my chest. Gatsby's eyes remained fixed on the road, his expression inscrutable. After a long silence, he began to speak, his voice low and resonant, each word carrying with it an undercurrent of something dark and unfathomable. "Nick, there are things about my past that I have never shared with anyone," he began, his tone measured and deliberate. "Stories that would chill you to the bone, truths that would make you question everything you think you know." I listened, my heart pounding in my chest, the air in the car growing colder with each passing moment. Gatsby's presence seemed to fill the space, his voice weaving a tapestry of dark memories and hidden truths. "I wasn't always the man you see before you," he continued, his eyes flickering with a strange light. "I was born James Gatz on a farm in North Dakota, but that name and that life were left behind long ago, discarded like a worn-out mask." He paused, his gaze distant, as if he were looking into the depths of some unfathomable abyss. "I attended St. Olaf's in Minnesota, but I couldn't stay there. Something called to me, something far more powerful than any earthly ambition. I felt a chill run down my spine, the air growing thicker, the shadows deeper. Gatsby's voice was like a dark incantation, each word a key unlocking a door to a world of nightmares. "I met a man named Dan Cody," he continued, his tone growing more intense. "A yacht owner, a wealthy man, but more than that, a man who had dabbled in the forbidden, who had glimpsed the secrets that lie beyond the veil of our reality." The name sent a shiver through me, and I could almost see the ghostly figure of Dan Cody, a specter haunting Gatsby's past. He took me under his wing, showed me things I could never have imagined. We sailed together, traveled to places that exist only in the darkest corners of the mind. Gatsby's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath me was shifting. He introduced me to a world of shadows and whispers, a world where the lines between the living and the dead are blurred. I learned of ancient rites, dark rituals that could summon powers beyond comprehension. His words painted a picture of a past filled with dark ceremonies and forbidden knowledge, a journey into the heart of darkness itself. Cody taught me how to harness these forces, how to bend them to my will, but he also warned me of the dangers, the price that must be paid. Gatsby's smile was a twisted parody of joy, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "I have paid that price, Nick. I have danced with the shadows and emerged changed, no longer bound by the same rules that govern ordinary men." The car seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the engines growl a constant, menacing presence. The world outside was a blur of light and shadow, a shifting landscape that defied comprehension. "There were others," Gatsby continued, his voice growing softer, more reflective. "Others who sought the same knowledge, who delved into the same darkness. Some were consumed by it, lost forever in the void. But I survived. I thrived. And now, I am what you see before you." His gaze bored into mine, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "But the shadows, Nick. The shadows are always there, always watching. They have a way of creeping back, no matter how far you try to run." The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with the weight of Gatsby's revelations. His past was a dark, tangled web of secrets and shadows, a journey through a world where the supernatural and the ordinary were inextricably linked. "And now, old sport," Gatsby said, his smile widening, "you are part of this world too. You have been drawn into the web, and there is no turning back." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a shiver down my spine. The sense of mystery and danger was overwhelming, a palpable force that seemed to pulse through the very fabric of the car. As we drove on, the road stretching out into an uncertain horizon, I knew that I had crossed a threshold, stepped into a realm where reality and nightmare were entwined in an uneasy dance. Gatsby's past was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, and I was now a part of that dark tapestry. And as the car sped through the twilight, I felt the weight of those shadows pressing in around me, the whispers of the past echoing in my ears. The sense of foreboding was a constant presence, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly left behind, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. The cab ride into the city was a blur of noise and light, the chaos of New York folding around us like a living, breathing entity. Gatsby sat beside me, his expression inscrutable, his gaze distant. There was an air of anticipation, a tension that crackled in the space between us. The sense of foreboding from our earlier conversation lingered, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. We arrived at a small, unassuming restaurant tucked away on a side street, its exterior weathered and unremarkable. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of garlic and old wood, the low hum of conversation a constant background murmur. Gatsby led me to a secluded corner table where a man was already seated, his back to us. As we approached, the man turned, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Meyer Wolfsheim was an unsettling figure, his appearance both ordinary and profoundly disturbing. He wore a neatly tailored suit, but his eyes, dark, beady, and unblinking, gave him the look of a predator. His smile was a mere twitch of the lips, devoid of warmth, more a baring of teeth than an expression of friendliness. "Mr. Carraway, this is Mr. Wolfsheim," Gatsby said, his voice smooth and controlled. "He's a friend of mine." Wolfsheim extended a hand, and I took it, feeling a cold, clammy grip that sent a shiver through me. "A pleasure," he said, his voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to crawl across my skin. We sat down, and the waiter brought us drinks without a word, his eyes avoiding ours as if he sensed the dark undercurrents at our table. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if we had stepped into a different world, one where shadows held sway and secrets whispered in the dark. Wolfsheim leaned forward, his gaze flicking between Gatsby and me. "So Gatsby tells me you're a trustworthy man," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something sinister. "That's good. Trust is hard to come by these days." There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, his words carefully chosen, each one laced with an unspoken threat. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his scrutiny, as if he were peeling back the layers of my soul, searching for something hidden beneath. Gatsby remained calm, his demeanor unruffled. "Nick is a good man," he said, his tone reassuring. "He understands the value of discretion." Wolfsheim nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Discretion is a valuable trait, indeed, especially in our line of work." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a chill through me. There was an undercurrent to their conversation, a sense of danger that pulsed beneath the surface. The restaurant seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows lengthening as the light outside faded. "Have you ever been to the old Metropole?" Wolfsheim asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. I shook my head, feeling a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. "No, I haven't." Wolfsheim's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "I was there the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal, a memorable evening to say the least." The casual mention of violence, the way he spoke of it as if it were a simple anecdote, sent a shiver down my spine. There was a darkness in Wolfsheim, a cold, calculating malevolence that was deeply unsettling. Gatsby shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Wolfsheim is quite knowledgeable about the city's darker aspects." Wolfsheim chuckled, a sound that was more growl than laughter. "One must be, in our business. There are many shadows in this city, many places where the light does not reach." The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with unspoken threats and hidden dangers. I could feel the weight of their secrets, the dark web of connections that bound them together. The shadows seemed to pulse, the dim light casting eerie patterns on the walls. Wolfsheim leaned back, his gaze still fixed on me. "Remember, Mr. Carraway, in our world, trust is everything. Betrayal, well, betrayal has a way of coming back to haunt you." The words were a warning, a chilling reminder of the darkness that surrounded us. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the sense of menace a constant presence. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an abyss, one misstep away from falling into a world of shadows and secrets. As the conversation shifted to more mundane topics, the sense of unease remained. Wolfsheim's presence was a constant reminder of the hidden dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The restaurant, once warm and inviting, now felt like a trap, the walls closing in around us. When we finally left, the night air was a welcome relief, the cool breeze a balm to my frayed nerves. But the shadows still lingered, the sense of foreboding clinging to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something dark and terrible, a hidden world where light could not penetrate and secrets thrived. Gatsby's world was a place of intrigue and menace, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. And as we walked away from the restaurant, I knew that I had only begun to scratch the surface of the darkness that lay within. The sun had long since set, and the night was thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to cling to everything. The lights of the city cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls, creating an eerie, ever-shifting tapestry of light and dark. Jordan Baker and I had retreated to a quiet corner of Gatsby's garden, the sounds of the distant party muted and ghostly. Jordan's face was illuminated by the soft glow of a single lantern, her features cast in a strange, almost ethereal light. She seemed more like a specter than a living being, her eyes gleaming with a secret knowledge that made my skin prickle with unease. She took a deep breath, her gaze distant as she began to speak. "Nick, there's something you need to know about Gatsby and Daisy," she said, her voice low and measured. "Something that goes back years, to a time when their lives were intertwined in ways that defy simple explanation." I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest, the air around us growing colder with each passing moment. Jordan's words were like a dark incantation, weaving a tale that was as tragic as it was mysterious. "It was 5 years ago," she began, her eyes flickering with the light of the lantern. "Daisy was just a girl, barely out of her teens, and she was the most beautiful creature anyone had ever seen. But there was something more to her, something that drew people to her in ways they couldn't understand." She paused, her gaze fixed on a distant point in the darkness. "And then, she met Gatsby. He was different then, not the man you see today. He was a young officer, full of dreams and ambition. But there was something else about him, something that seemed almost otherworldly." The shadows around us seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. Jordan's voice took on a haunting quality, each word a key unlocking a door to a past filled with secrets and shadows. "They fell in love," she continued, her tone wistful and melancholic. "A love that was intense, all-consuming. But there were forces at play, forces that neither of them could control. Gatsby had to leave, sent overseas by the military, and Daisy was left behind, her heart shattered." Jordan's eyes gleamed with a mixture of sadness and fear. "While he was gone, something changed in Daisy. She became distant, withdrawn, as if part of her had been lost. There were rumors, whispers of dark things that had happened, but no one knew for sure. And then, she met Tom Buchanan." The mention of Tom's name sent a shiver through me, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. Jordan's gaze was intense, her expression filled with a deep, unspoken fear. Tom was wealthy, powerful, and he offered Daisy a life of security. But it was a cold, loveless marriage, a gilded cage that trapped her in a world of appearances and lies. And then, out of the blue, Gatsby returned. The air seemed to crackle with tension, the shadows closing in around us. Jordan's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and dread. "He came back, not as the young officer he once was, but as the enigmatic, wealthy man you know today. No one knew how he had amassed his fortune, but there were rumors. Dark, unsettling rumors. Some said he had made a pact with forces beyond this world, others that he had delved into forbidden knowledge, trading his soul for wealth and power. The chilling revelation hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a shiver down my spine. The garden around us seemed to grow colder, the lantern's light flickering as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. "He's been searching for Daisy ever since," Jordan said, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "Everything he's done, everything he's built, has been for her. But the past is not easily forgotten, and the shadows that haunt Gatsby's life have a way of creeping back, no matter how far you try to run." The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with the weight of Jordan's words. The tragic and mysterious aspects of Daisy and Gatsby's past were a dark tapestry, woven with threads of love and loss, secrets and shadows. "And now," Jordan said, her eyes locking onto mine, "they're drawn back together like moths to a flame, but the forces that tore them apart are still at play, and the darkness that surrounds Gatsby is always watching, always waiting." The chilling revelation left me with a sense of dread, a feeling that the dark forces at play in Gatsby's life were far from finished. The night seemed to press in around us, the shadows whispering secrets that I could almost hear. As I walked Jordan to her car, the weight of her story settled over me like a shroud. The image of Gatsby and Daisy, bound by a love that defied time and space, haunted my thoughts. The sense of foreboding was a constant presence, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly left behind, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. And as I made my way back to my house, the moon casting long, eerie shadows on the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that the events set in motion by Gatsby and Daisy's reunion were far from over. The dark forces at play in their lives were gathering strength, and the sense of unease that gripped my heart was a silent warning of the storms yet to come. Chapter 5. When I came home to West Egg that night, the first thing I noticed was a strange, flickering light emanating from Gatsby's mansion. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground and twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with an oppressive humidity, the kind that seemed to seep into your very bones and linger there. Gatsby was waiting for me at my door, his eyes bright with a manic energy that was almost unnerving. He moved with a restless intensity, his every gesture charged with a sense of urgency and anticipation. It was as if the very air around him crackled with an unseen force, a barely contained tempest waiting to be unleashed. "Nick, old sport," he greeted me, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you ready? Is everything set?" I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, a frenetic edge that hinted at the depths of his obsession. He had been preparing for this moment for days, and the strain was beginning to show. As we walked towards his mansion, the light grew brighter, almost blinding in its intensity. The shadows it cast seemed to writhe and contort, their movements sinister and unnatural. The house itself loomed before us, a dark monolith that seemed to breathe with an otherworldly life. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, their fragrance almost overpowering. Gatsby had filled every room with them, their vivid colors a stark contrast to the dim, flickering light. He moved through the rooms with a frantic energy, adjusting vases and rearranging cushions, his hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Everything has to be perfect," he muttered to himself, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for invisible flaws. "She has to see. She has to understand." I watched him, a sense of unease growing in my chest. There was something almost supernatural about his preparations, as if he were trying to cast a spell, to summon something from the depths of his past. The air around us seemed to hum with an unseen energy, a low, throbbing vibration that set my nerves on edge. "Gatsby," I said, trying to break through his fevered concentration. "You need to calm down. Everything will be fine." He looked at me, his eyes wide and almost frantic. "You don't understand, Nick. This is everything. This is my chance to make things right, to rewrite the past. I can't afford to fail." There was a desperation in his voice, a haunting echo of the years he had spent chasing an unattainable dream. His obsession with Daisy had consumed him, twisted him into something both magnificent and terrifying. The mansion, with its eerie light and unnatural stillness, seemed to reflect that transformation, a physical manifestation of his relentless pursuit. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on us from all sides. Gatsby's preparations took on a frantic, almost ritualistic quality, each movement precise and deliberate, as if he were performing some dark incantation. The flowers, the candles, the meticulously arranged furniture, all were part of a grand, otherworldly tableau designed to summon the past and bind it to the present. "She's coming," Gatsby whispered, his voice a trembling whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "She's finally coming." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, the flickering light casting ghostly shadows that danced and twisted in anticipation. The sense of foreboding was almost unbearable, a looming darkness that threatened to engulf us all. As we stood there, waiting for the moment that would either fulfill Gatsby's dream or shatter it into 1,000 pieces, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something vast and terrible. The past, with all its secrets and shadows, was reaching out to claim us, and there was no turning back. And in that moment, as the clock ticked inexorably forward, the mansion seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a dark, brooding presence that watched and waited. The air was thick with the weight of Gatsby's obsession, and the sense of impending doom was a constant, suffocating presence. The doorbell rang, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the heavy silence. Gatsby froze, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The moment had arrived, and the shadows that had haunted him for so long were finally about to be confronted. As he moved towards the door, his steps slow and deliberate, I could feel the weight of his emotions pressing down on me. The mansion, with its eerie light and unnatural stillness, seemed to hold its breath, the air crackling with a tension that was almost unbearable. And as the door slowly opened, revealing the figure of Daisy Buchanan standing in the dim light, I knew that we had crossed a threshold, stepped into a realm where the past and present were inextricably intertwined, and the shadows that haunted Gatsby's dreams were about to be unleashed. The day of the meeting dawned with an overcast sky, the clouds hanging low and heavy, casting a pall over West Egg. The air was thick with an oppressive humidity, and a sense of anticipation crackled in the atmosphere like distant thunder. As I guided Daisy towards Gatsby's mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a place where the veil between the ordinary and the supernatural had worn thin. Daisy sat beside me in the car, her eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. She chatted nervously, her laughter high and brittle, a fragile veneer over the tension that simmered beneath the surface. I tried to reassure her, but my own nerves were on edge, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. As we turned onto Gatsby's driveway, the mansion loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the brooding sky. The windows, usually bright with light and laughter, were dim and shadowed, and the entire structure seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, their cloying perfume almost overwhelming, and the garden, usually so meticulously maintained, had taken on an untamed, almost feral quality. We parked and approached the front door, the gravel crunching under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The door opened before we could knock, revealing Gatsby standing there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. He looked both exhilarated and terrified, as if he were on the brink of some great revelation or catastrophe. "Daisy," he breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. "It's so good to see you." Daisy smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a flicker of something dark and uncertain. "Hello, Jay," she replied softly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of emotion that made my heart ache. Gatsby stepped aside to let us in, his movements stiff and awkward, as if he were struggling to maintain control over his emotions. The air inside the mansion was thick and heavy, the scent of flowers mingling with a strange metallic tang that set my nerves on edge. The light was dim, the shadows deep and shifting, and the entire house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. As we moved through the foyer, I noticed that the grand chandelier above us flickered and swayed, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. The paintings seemed to watch us with dark, knowing eyes, their expressions shifting in the uncertain light. The flowers, which had once added a touch of elegance to the rooms, now seemed almost sinister, their vibrant colors a jarring contrast to the oppressive atmosphere. Gatsby led us to the drawing room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, the flames casting a flickering spectral light. The furniture was arranged with obsessive precision, each piece carefully placed to create a perfect, yet unnatural tableau. The air was thick with tension, and the room seemed to close in around us, the walls pressing closer with each passing moment. Daisy sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Gatsby stood before her, his expression a mixture of longing and dread, his hands trembling at his sides. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, the weight of their unspoken emotions filling the room like a tangible presence. Finally, Gatsby broke the silence, his voice low and trembling. "I've waited so long for this moment," he said, his eyes fixed on Daisy. "I've dreamed of it, planned for it, and now that it's here, I'm almost afraid." Daisy looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange, haunted light. "Afraid of what, Jay?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Afraid that it won't be enough," he replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "Afraid that after all these years, I won't be able to make things right." The sense of foreboding grew stronger, the shadows deepening around us. The mansion seemed to hum with an unseen energy, a low, resonant vibration that set my teeth on edge. The air was thick with the weight of their shared history, the ghosts of their past lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce. Gatsby moved closer to Daisy, his hands reaching out as if to touch her, but stopping just short. "Daisy," he whispered, his voice filled with a desperate longing. "I've built all of this for you, to show you that I'm worthy. But now, standing here, I realize that none of it matters. All that matters is you." Daisy's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take his hands, her touch gentle but firm. "Jay," she said, her voice trembling, "you don't have to prove anything to me. I'm here, and that's all that matters." The room seemed to exhale, the oppressive tension easing just slightly, but the sense of unease remained. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that danced on the walls. The mansion, with its eerie light and shifting shadows, seemed to watch them, a silent witness to their reunion. As they stood there, their hands clasped together, the sense of foreboding lingered, a dark promise of the challenges yet to come. The past, with all its secrets and shadows, was not so easily left behind, and the forces that had shaped their lives were still at play, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as I watched them, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the brink of something vast and terrible, a storm that would sweep us all into its dark embrace. The mansion, with its strange, almost ghostly transformation, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a dark, brooding presence that watched and waited. The moment had arrived. As the heavy wooden door creaked open, Gatsby stood motionless in the dim light, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a mix of anticipation and dread. Daisy stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat as she beheld the man who had haunted her dreams and nightmares for years. For a long, agonizing moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence thick and suffocating. The air seemed to vibrate with a strange, otherworldly energy, a low hum that set my teeth on edge. The shadows around us deepened, as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in, eager to witness the reunion of these two souls. "Daisy," Gatsby whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. The sound of his voice seemed to echo through the room, a haunting reverberation that sent a chill down my spine. "Jay," Daisy replied, her voice barely more than a breath. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locked onto his, as if afraid that he might disappear if she looked away. Gatsby moved towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were navigating a dream or a nightmare. The air between them seemed to crackle with an unseen force, a magnetic pull that drew them together even as it threatened to tear them apart. The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. As they finally stood face to face, the weight of their shared history hung over them like a dark cloud. Gatsby reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched her cheek. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, a shockwave of emotion that was almost palpable. Daisy's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up to clasp his hand, her touch a lifeline in the storm of their emotions. "I've waited so long for this moment," Gatsby said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day, every night, I've dreamed of seeing you again, of holding you in my arms." Daisy's tears spilled over, her voice choked with sobs. "I never stopped thinking about you, Jay. Not for a single day. But so much has happened. So much has changed." The sense of foreboding grew stronger, the shadows around us pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. The room seemed to hold its breath, the flickering light casting eerie patterns on the walls. The past, with all its secrets and shadows, was pressing in on them, a relentless force that refused to be ignored. Gatsby's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes burning with an intense, almost desperate light. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice rising with a fervent intensity. "None of it matters. All that matters is that we're here now together." The air around them seemed to shimmer, a strange spectral light enveloping them in a ghostly embrace. The room grew colder still, the fire in the hearth dimming as if consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, creeping closer, reaching out with grasping, claw-like tendrils. Daisy shivered, her gaze flickering to the shadows that loomed around them. "Jay, there's so much we need to talk about, so much we need to understand." Gatsby nodded, his expression resolute. "We will, Daisy. We will. But first, let me show you something." He led her through the dimly lit rooms of the mansion, his hand never leaving hers. The house seemed to change as they moved, the walls shifting and warping, the shadows whispering secrets that only they could hear. The sense of unease was almost unbearable, the air thick with a palpable tension. As they entered the grand ballroom, the sight that met them was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. The room was filled with flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dark, brooding atmosphere. The chandelier above them cast a flickering, spectral light, and the air was thick with the scent of roses, their fragrance almost suffocating. Gatsby turned to Daisy, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I did all of this for you," he said, his voice trembling. "Everything I've built, everything I've achieved, it's all been for you." Daisy's gaze swept over the room, her expression a mix of wonder and sorrow. "Jay, it's beautiful, but it's also so overwhelming. So much has changed." The sense of foreboding grew stronger, the shadows closing in around them. The past was not easily left behind, and the darkness that had shaped their lives was a constant, haunting presence. The room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a low, throbbing vibration that set my nerves on edge. Gatsby took a step closer, his gaze intense and unwavering. "We can start over, Daisy. We can make things right. Together, We can create a new future." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a shiver down my spine. The mansion, with its eerie light and shifting shadows, seemed to watch them, a silent witness to their reunion. The sense of unease was a constant presence, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. As Gatsby and Daisy stood together, their hands clasped tightly, the weight of their shared history pressed down on them, a dark force that refused to be ignored. The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, a constant reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly left behind, and the shadows held 1,000 whispered tales. As Gatsby led Daisy through the grand hallways of his mansion, the air seemed to grow colder, the light dimmer. The house was a labyrinth of opulence, each room a testament to Gatsby's wealth and obsessive attention to detail. Yet there was something unsettling about the place, a sense that beneath the veneer of luxury lay hidden dangers and unspoken secrets. They moved through the library first, its walls lined with books that seemed to watch them with silent, knowing eyes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, the shadows deep and shifting. Gatsby's voice was a low murmur as he spoke of rare editions and priceless volumes, but there was an edge to his tone, a tension that hinted at darker things. "The books are real, Daisy," he said, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Every one of them. They're a testament to my dedication, my pursuit of knowledge. But knowledge can be a dangerous thing, can't it?" Daisy shivered, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting the shadows to come to life. "Yes, Jay, it can be." They moved on to the drawing room, where the walls were adorned with paintings of eerie, otherworldly landscapes. The colors were vivid, almost too bright, and the scenes depicted seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Gatsby watched Daisy's reaction closely, his expression a mix of pride and unease. "I chose these paintings myself," he said softly. "Each one speaks to me, tells a story. Can you hear them, Daisy? Can you hear what they're saying?" Daisy nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on a painting of a dark, twisted forest. "It's beautiful, but it's also so strange, almost as if it's alive." Gatsby smiled, a tight, strained smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, that's exactly it. This house, Daisy, it's more than just a collection of rooms and objects. It's a living thing, a reflection of my dreams and my nightmares." As they continued the tour, the sense of unease grew stronger. The mansion was filled with treasures from around the world, each item carefully chosen and meticulously placed. But there was an almost obsessive quality to the arrangement, a feeling that every piece was part of a larger, darker puzzle. In the music room, a grand piano stood in the center, its glossy surface reflecting the flickering light of the chandelier above. Gatsby ran his fingers over the keys, a discordant melody echoing through the room. The sound was haunting, almost spectral, and it sent a shiver down Daisy's spine. "I've played this piano many nights, thinking of you," Gatsby said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The music, it has a way of bringing the past to life, doesn't it?" Daisy's eyes were wide, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "Yes, Jay, it does. But sometimes the past is better left where it belongs." Gatsby led her to the grand staircase, its steps covered in a deep crimson carpet that seemed to absorb the light. The walls were lined with portraits of stern, unsmiling faces, their eyes following them as they ascended. The air grew colder still, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. "This house, it's filled with memories," Gatsby said, his gaze distant. "Memories of a life spent in pursuit of a dream. But dreams can be elusive, Daisy. They can slip through your fingers like smoke." They reached the master bedroom, a vast, opulent space filled with rich fabrics and gleaming furniture. But there was a sense of desolation about the room, an emptiness that belied its grandeur. Gatsby's voice was soft, almost reverent as he spoke. "This is where I dreamed of you, night after night, he said, his eyes locked onto hers. "Where I imagined our life together, our future. But dreams can be haunted, can't they?" Daisy nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "Yes, Jay, they can." Gatsby moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes to reveal the garden below. The flowers, once so vibrant, now seemed almost menacing in the dim light, their colors too bright, too intense. The garden itself was a tangle of shadows and light, a place where secrets whispered on the breeze. "I've built all of this for you, Daisy," Gatsby said, his voice filled with a desperate longing. "But now that you're here, I realize that it's not enough. This house, this life, it's a reflection of my obsession, my need to hold on to something that was never truly mine." The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with unspoken secrets and hidden dangers. The mansion, with its eerie opulence and shifting shadows, seemed to close in around them, a dark, brooding presence that watched and waited. Daisy moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Jay, you don't have to prove anything to me. I'm here, and that's all that matters." Gatsby's eyes filled with tears, his expression a mix of hope and despair. "But is it enough, Daisy? Can it ever be enough?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the shadows pulsing with a dark energy. The past, with all its secrets and sorrows, was a constant, haunting presence, a reminder that the darkness was never far away. As they stood together, looking out over the garden, the sense of unease lingered, a dark promise of the challenges yet to come. The mansion, with its strange, almost otherworldly quality, was a reflection of Gatsby's soul, a place where dreams and nightmares intertwined in an uneasy dance. And as they turned away from the window, the shadows seemed to follow them, whispering secrets that only they could hear. The sense of foreboding was a constant presence, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly gone, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. The rain began to fall in earnest as Gatsby, Daisy, and I settled into the dimly lit parlor. The windows rattled with each gust of wind, the sound echoing through the cavernous mansion like distant ghostly whispers. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, the weight of the past pressing down on us from every corner of the room. Gatsby had lit a fire in the grand fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls, creating an eerie, ever-shifting tapestry of light and dark. The furniture, opulent and imposing, seemed almost to loom over us, its presence a constant reminder of Gatsby's obsessive pursuit of perfection. Daisy sat close to Gatsby on the sofa, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and unease as she took in her surroundings. Gatsby's expression was one of intense concentration, his gaze fixed on her as if he feared she might vanish if he looked away for even a moment. "Do you remember this song, Daisy?" Gatsby asked, his voice low and tremulous. He gestured towards the grand piano where a record player sat, its needle poised over an old vinyl record. Daisy nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "Yes, Jay, I do." Gatsby smiled, a strained, almost desperate smile, and set the needle down. The music began to play, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the mansion. The notes were soft and mournful, filled with a longing that sent shivers down my spine. As the music played, the room grew colder, the fire in the hearth flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. The shadows deepened, their movements more pronounced, almost sinister. The sense of foreboding was palpable, a dark presence that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of our perception. Gatsby turned to Daisy, his eyes filled with a fierce intensity. "I built all of this for you, Daisy. Every brick, every piece of furniture, every flower in the garden. It's all for you." Daisy's hand tightened on his arm, her voice a trembling whisper. "I know, Jay, and it's beautiful, but—" Her words trailed off, her gaze shifting to the shadows that loomed around us. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, as if she sensed the dark forces at play in Gatsby's world. Gatsby leaned closer, his voice urgent. "But what, Daisy? Tell me." Daisy hesitated, her eyes darting to the flickering shadows. "But sometimes, Jay, it feels like there's something here, something watching us. It's like this house has a life of its own, and it's not always kind." The sense of unease grew stronger, the air thick with tension. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their movements almost predatory. The fire in the hearth flared, casting a brief, blinding light before dimming once more. Gatsby's expression darkened, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "There are things, Daisy, things that you can't understand, forces that we can't control. But I promise you, I will protect you from them. I will do whatever it takes." The words hung in the air, a dark promise that sent a chill through me. The mansion, with its eerie light and shifting shadows, seemed to close in around us, a malevolent presence that watched and waited. As the music played on, the sense of foreboding grew almost unbearable. The shadows danced and twisted, their movements a dark, mocking reflection of our own. The past, with all its secrets and sorrows, was a constant, haunting presence, a reminder that the darkness was never far away. Daisy shivered, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken fear. "Jay, what have you done?" Gatsby's gaze was intense, his voice filled with a dark, desperate hope. "I've done what I had to do, Daisy. For you. Always for you." The room grew colder still, the fire barely more than a faint glow. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, their movements growing more pronounced, more menacing. The sense of foreboding was almost suffocating, the air thick with unspoken secrets and hidden dangers. As the music reached its haunting crescendo, a sudden chilling silence fell over the room. The fire flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The shadows loomed larger, their presence almost tangible, a dark force that seemed to press in on us from all sides. And then, in the darkness, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but filled with a cold, mocking malice. "You cannot escape the past, Jay Gatsby. You cannot outrun the shadows." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, my heart pounding in my chest. Gatsby's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. Daisy clung to him, her eyes filled with tears, her body trembling. The shadows pressed closer, their presence a suffocating weight. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, a dark promise of the storms yet to come. The mansion, with its eerie opulence and shifting shadows, was a reflection of Gatsby's soul, a place where dreams and nightmares intertwined in an uneasy dance. As we sat there in the darkness, the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly gone, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. And as the night wore on, the shadows whispered their secrets, their dark promises echoing through the haunted halls of Gatsby's mansion. The sense of foreboding was a constant presence, a reminder that the forces at play in Gatsby's life were far from finished. And in that moment, as the shadows closed in, I knew that we had only begun to glimpse the true darkness that lay within. Chapter 6. About this time, an elusive rumor regarding Gatsby's past began to circulate among the whispering elite of West Egg and beyond. It was said that James Gats of North Dakota had not simply transformed into Jay Gatsby by sheer force of will and charm. No, there were darker forces at play, shadows that moved in the corners of his life, unseen but ever present. James Gats was born in a world of stark reality and unforgiving poverty. The son of shiftless farm people, he knew early on that his destiny lay far from the barren fields of his childhood. But his rise from those bleak beginnings to the opulence of West Egg was not merely a tale of ambition. There were whispers of a pact made in the dead of night, beneath a sky heavy with portentous clouds, with powers that demanded more than just determination. As a young man, James Gats spent long, restless nights staring out at the dark, foreboding expanse of the North Dakota plains, yearning for something beyond the mundane reality that surrounded him. It was during one of these nights that he encountered Dan Cody, a silver-haired titan whose yacht glittered like a phantom on the moonlit waters of Lake Superior. Cody was no ordinary man. There was a whisper about him, a hint of something otherworldly. Some said he had discovered forbidden secrets during his voyages, truths that no mortal should possess. Gats, drawn by an irresistible force, presented himself to Cody, a young man burning with desire and desperation. The bond between them was immediate and unsettling. Cody saw in Gats not just a protege, but a vessel for his own dark knowledge. The years that followed were a blur of shadowy dealings and whispered incantations as Cody imparted his arcane wisdom to the eager young man. Gats absorbed everything, his transformation into Gatsby marked by an uncanny intensity that seemed to warp the very air around him. There were stories of strange rituals performed aboard Cody's yacht, of nights spent in fevered trances as the older man unveiled the mysteries of the cosmos. Gatsby's rise to wealth was swift and inexplicable, fueled by an otherworldly energy that seemed to defy the natural order. His parties, with their dazzling lights and endless revelry, were more than just social gatherings. They were manifestations of his power, spells cast to maintain his hold over the world he had created. Yet, despite his outward success, Gatsby was haunted by the shadows of his past. The pact he had made, the knowledge he had gained, these were not things that could be easily left behind. There were nights when the lights of his mansion flickered and dimmed, when whispers echoed through the empty halls, voices from the past demanding their due. As the rumors about Gatsby's origins grew, so did the sense of unease that surrounded him. People spoke of a dark presence that lingered just out of sight, a force that seemed to watch and wait. Gatsby himself, despite his charming facade, was often seen gazing out at the green light across the bay, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. The truth of Gatsby's past was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, desperation, and dark power. It was a story that defied easy explanation, a tale that whispered of hidden depths and unseen forces. And as the shadows of his past began to encroach upon the bright lights of his present, it became clear that Gatsby's story was far from over. The sense of foreboding that hung over West Egg grew heavier with each passing day, the shadows lengthening and deepening. Gatsby's world, once so vibrant and full of promise, now seemed tinged with an ominous darkness, a reminder that the past was never truly left behind, and that the forces that had shaped his rise were always waiting, just out of sight. And as the rumors continued to swirl, the mansion at West Egg stood as a monument to Gatsby's ambition and his dark legacy, a place where dreams and nightmares were woven together in an intricate, inescapable web. I had heard the stories, whispers carried on the wind, tales told in hushed tones at Gatsby's glittering parties. The name Dan Cody was always mentioned with a peculiar reverence, mingled with fear, a man who had shaped Gatsby's destiny in ways that defied ordinary understanding. Dan Cody was a figure of legend, a silver-haired titan whose wealth and power seemed almost otherworldly. He sailed the seas in a grand yacht that gleamed like a ghost ship under the moonlight, its sails billowing like spectral wings. When Gatsby first laid eyes on Cody's vessel, it was as if he were staring into the abyss, a yawning chasm that promised both glory and damnation. James Gats, a young man of 19, had been drifting aimlessly along the shores of Lake Superior, a soul in search of purpose. One night, as a storm rolled in, he spotted Cody's yacht, its outline stark against the roiling sky. The air crackled with electricity, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. Gats knew that this was a turning point, a moment that would define the rest of his life. Cody, sensing something unique in the boy who stood before him, took Gats under his wing. The bond they formed was immediate and intense, an eerie connection that went beyond mere mentorship. Cody saw in Gats a vessel for his dark knowledge, a successor who could carry on his legacy of secrets and power. The years that followed were a blur of shadowy dealings and whispered incantations. Cody imparted his arcane wisdom to the eager young man, teaching him the ways of the world and the hidden forces that governed it. Gatsby absorbed everything, his transformation marked by an uncanny intensity that seemed to warp the very air around him. Cody's yacht became a floating sanctuary of secrets, a place where reality and the supernatural intertwined. Nights were spent in fevered trances as Cody unveiled the mysteries of the cosmos, secrets that no mortal should possess. Gatsby's eyes gleamed with a strange light, a fire that burned with the knowledge of forbidden things. There were rumors of strange rituals performed aboard the yacht, of nights when the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed to blur. Cody would speak of the old gods, of ancient powers that slept beneath the waves, waiting to be awakened. Gatsby listened, his mind opening to possibilities that defied the ordinary, his ambition growing darker and more consuming. Cody's influence was profound, shaping Gatsby into the man he would become. But there was a price to be paid for such knowledge, a darkness that crept into Gatsby's soul, an ever-present shadow that followed him wherever he went. The bond between them was both a blessing and a curse, a source of power and a harbinger of doom. As the years passed, Cody's health began to decline, his once vibrant presence fading into a specter of its former self. Gatsby watched over him with a mixture of reverence and fear, the secrets they shared binding them together in a web of darkness and deceit. Cody's death was sudden and mysterious, a final act that left Gatsby with a fortune and a legacy of shadows. I listened to these stories, a chill running down my spine. The relationship between Gatsby and Cody was more than just that of mentor and protege. It was a pact, a covenant forged in darkness, with secrets that lingered like ghosts in the corners of Gatsby's mansion. Gatsby's rise to wealth was swift and inexplicable, fueled by an otherworldly energy that seemed to defy the natural order. His parties, with their dazzling lights and endless revelry, were more than just social gatherings. They were manifestations of his power, spells cast to maintain his hold over the world he had created. Yet, despite his outward success, Gatsby was haunted by the shadows of his past. The pact he had made, the knowledge he had gained, these were not things that could be easily left behind. There were nights when the lights of his mansion flickered and dimmed, when whispers echoed through the empty halls, voices from the past demanding their due. The bond between Gatsby and Cody was a dark thread woven into the fabric of his life, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, and the shadows were always watching. The sense of foreboding that hung over West Egg grew heavier with each passing day, the shadows lengthening and deepening. Gatsby's world, once so vibrant and full of promise, now seemed tinged with an ominous darkness, a reminder that the forces that had shaped his rise were far from finished. The mansion at West Egg stood as a monument to Gatsby's ambition and his dark legacy, a place where dreams and nightmares were woven together in an intricate, inescapable web. And as I pondered the stories I had heard, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of Gatsby's past were closing in, ready to reclaim what was theirs. The sense of unease was a constant presence, a reminder that in Gatsby's world the past was never truly left behind, and the darkness was always lurking just out of sight. The summer sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across Gatsby's mansion. The house, with its grandiosity and opulence, seemed to brood under the fading light, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes watching the approach of Tom Buchanan with a cold, calculating gaze. Tom arrived with an air of arrogance, his presence like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of conflict. He moved through the hallways of Gatsby's mansion with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, his eyes flickering over the lavish decor, taking in every detail with a critical, almost predatory scrutiny. Gatsby met him at the entrance of the parlor, his expression a mask of polite indifference. The tension between them was palpable, a silent, simmering animosity that seemed to thicken the air around them. The mansion's opulence felt oppressive, the extravagant surroundings taking on a sinister quality in the gathering twilight. "Tom," Gatsby greeted him, his voice calm but edged with an underlying tension. "Welcome to my home." Tom's smile was thin and sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. "Gatsby," he replied, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Quite a place you have here. Almost too much, wouldn't you say?" Gatsby's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the only hint of the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. "I suppose it depends on one's perspective," he said evenly. "Would you care for a drink?" Tom nodded, his gaze still roaming the room with a predatory glint. "I think I will." They moved to the grand sitting room, where the fire crackled with an unnatural intensity, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. The walls, adorned with paintings of eerie landscapes and haunting portraits, seemed to close in around them, creating a sense of claustrophobic unease. Gatsby poured them both a drink, his movements precise and controlled. He handed a glass to Tom, their fingers brushing for a brief moment, a contact that sent a jolt of tension through the air. "To new acquaintances," Tom said, raising his glass, his smile never reaching his eyes. "To new acquaintances," Gatsby echoed, his voice cool and measured. They sipped their drinks in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant murmur of the evening's revelry. The tension between them was almost tangible, a dark undercurrent that threatened to break through the surface at any moment. "So, Gatsby," Tom began, his tone casual but with an edge of menace. "Tell me, what exactly is it that you do?" Gatsby's smile was tight, his eyes sharp. "I'm in the business of making dreams come true, Tom. Surely you can appreciate that." Tom's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Dreams, huh? Funny thing about dreams, they have a way of turning into nightmares." Gatsby's gaze darkened, his expression hardening. "That depends on the dream and the dreamer." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The fire flickered and dimmed, as if struggling against an unseen force. Tom leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what about your dreams, Gatsby? What is it that you're dreaming of?" Gatsby met his gaze unflinchingly, his voice low and dangerous. "That's something you'll never understand, Tom." Tom's smile widened, a predator sensing weakness. "Oh, I think I understand more than you realize. You see, I know your type, the kind that thinks they can buy their way into anything. But some things can't be bought." The tension was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken threats. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the fire casting an eerie, flickering light that made the walls appear to close in around them. Gatsby's voice was icy, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. "Careful, Tom. You might find yourself in over your head." Tom's laugh was a low, menacing rumble. "I'm not the one who needs to be careful, Gatsby. You see, there are things in this world that money can't fix, and some things, once broken, can never be repaired." The room seemed to shudder, the shadows deepening, as if responding to the dark currents of their conversation. The fire blazed up suddenly, casting grotesque shapes on the walls, as if the mansion itself were reacting to the tension between them. Gatsby's expression was unreadable, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "I'm not afraid of you, Tom, or of anyone." Tom leaned back, his smile cold and calculating. "You should be, Gatsby. You should be." The sense of foreboding was almost overwhelming, the air charged with a dark, electric tension. The shadows around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own, whispering secrets and promises of things yet to come. As Tom rose to leave, his parting words hung in the air like a dark omen. "Be careful, Gatsby. The past has a way of catching up with you, and some things are best left buried." Gatsby watched him go, his eyes blazing with a cold fury, the shadows around him deepening. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, the fire flickering and casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. And as the door closed behind Tom, The sense of foreboding lingered, a dark promise of the storms yet to come. The shadows whispered their secrets, the darkness pressing in around Gatsby, a reminder that the past was never truly gone and the darkness was always waiting, just out of sight. The night of Gatsby's grand party arrived with an oppressive, almost electric tension hanging in the air. The mansion was ablaze with light, the grounds filled with revelers, but there was an underlying sense of unease that seemed to permeate every corner of the estate. The laughter and music, usually so vibrant and joyous, now seemed hollow, echoing with a strange, dissonant note that set my teeth on edge. Gatsby moved through the crowd like a ghost, his eyes constantly scanning the faces around him, searching for something. Or someone. There was a palpable energy about him, a barely contained frenzy that seemed to ripple through the guests, heightening the already charged atmosphere. I watched him from a distance, my own nerves fraying as the night wore on. It was then that I saw Tom Buchanan make his entrance, his presence like a dark storm cloud rolling into the brightly lit garden. He moved with a confident swagger, his eyes cold and calculating as they swept over the scene, searching for Gatsby. Their confrontation was inevitable, a collision of forces that had been building since the moment they first laid eyes on each other. Gatsby spotted Tom almost immediately, his expression hardening, the shadows around him deepening as he made his way through the throng of guests. When they finally stood face to face, the air seemed to crackle with a dark energy, the surrounding revelers oblivious to the storm brewing in their midst. The music and laughter faded into the background, leaving only the tense silence between Gatsby and Tom, a silence that threatened to explode at any moment. "Enjoying the party, Tom?" Gatsby's voice was cool, almost too controlled, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. Tom's smile was thin and predatory. "It's quite the spectacle, Gatsby. You certainly know how to throw a party." Gatsby's gaze never wavered, his expression a mask of calm. "I'm glad you could make it. It's always good to see familiar faces." The words were polite, but the tension between them was palpable, a dark undercurrent that seemed to thrum through the very air. The shadows around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own, whispering secrets and promises of things yet to come. Tom took a step closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. I couldn't resist. I wanted to see for myself what all the fuss was about, and to see the man who's been causing so much excitement. Gatsby's smile was tight, his voice dangerously calm. "I aim to please." The atmosphere grew heavier, the sense of impending doom almost suffocating. The guests around them continued to laugh and dance, oblivious to the dark confrontation unfolding in their midst. The lights flickered, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls, as if the mansion itself were reacting to the tension. Tom's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Tell me, Gatsby, what exactly do you hope to achieve with all of this? What's your endgame?" Gatsby's smile faded, his eyes growing cold and hard. "My goals are my own, Tom, but rest assured they don't concern you." Tom's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Oh, I think they do. You've made it quite clear that you have designs on something, or someone, that belongs to me." Gatsby's jaw tightened, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Daisy is not a possession, Tom. She's a person, and she can make her own choices." The words hung in the air like a dark promise, the shadows around them deepening, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. The music seemed to falter, the laughter turning brittle and strained. The guests were beginning to sense the tension, their movements slowing, eyes darting nervously towards the confrontation. Tom's smile widened, a predator sensing weakness. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what you want? You think your money and your parties can erase the past?" Gatsby's eyes blazed with a cold fury. "The past is not as set in stone as you think, Tom. People change. Circumstances change." Tom's expression darkened, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Some things never change, Gatsby. Some things are eternal." The word sent a chill through me, a sense of impending doom settling over the scene. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the lights flickering as if struggling against the darkness. The mansion, with its eerie opulence and shifting shadows, seemed to close in around them, a dark, brooding presence that watched and waited. Gatsby took a step closer, his voice a cold whisper. "You underestimate me, Tom, and that will be your downfall." Tom's eyes flashed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "We'll see about that, Gatsby. We'll see." The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun, the tension lingering in the air like a dark cloud. The guests resumed their revelry, their laughter and music a jarring contrast to the sense of impending doom that hung over the mansion. As Gatsby and Tom parted ways, the shadows seemed to follow them, whispering their dark secrets and promises of things yet to come. The sense of foreboding was almost unbearable, a constant reminder that the forces at play in Gatsby's world were far from finished. And as the night wore on, the darkness deepened, the mansion standing as a silent witness to the unfolding drama. The sense of dread and anticipation lingered, a dark promise of the storms yet to come. The party had ended, the last of the guests having departed into the murky, pre-dawn hours. The mansion, once so alive with light and sound, now stood in an eerie silence, its grand halls and opulent rooms shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the scent of spilled champagne and wilting flowers, the remnants of revelry clinging to the walls like ghostly echoes. I wandered through the empty mansion, my footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. The sense of unease that had permeated the night lingered, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to seep into my very bones. Gatsby's confrontation with Tom had left an indelible mark on the evening, a dark stain that colored everything with a sense of impending doom. I found Gatsby standing alone on the terrace, his silhouette stark against the pale light of the approaching dawn. He stared out at the bay, his gaze fixed on the distant green light that marked Daisy's dock. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Gatsby," I called softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a haunted, faraway look. "Nick," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I joined him on the terrace, the cool morning air biting against my skin. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a lone seagull. Gatsby's gaze returned to the green light, a flicker of something dark and desperate in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder, Nick?" he began, his voice low and filled with a strange, almost otherworldly resonance. "If all of this, everything I've built, everything I've done, if it's all just a dream?" I shivered, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. "A dream?" Gatsby nodded, his eyes never leaving the green light. "A dream of something I can never truly have. A dream that consumes everything in its path, leaving nothing but shadows and ashes." The words hung in the air, a dark, chilling echo that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the night. The shadows around us deepened, the darkness pressing in like a living thing, whispering secrets that only Gatsby could hear. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I wonder if I'm the dreamer, or if I'm the dream. If all of this, my life, my love for Daisy, if it's all just an illusion, a trick of the light." A chill ran down my spine, the sense of unease almost suffocating. "Gatsby, what are you saying?" He turned to me then, his eyes burning with a fierce, unsettling light. "I'm saying, Nick, that dreams can be dangerous. They can twist and turn, becoming something dark and monstrous. They can consume you, and everything you hold dear." The words sent a jolt of fear through me, a dark promise of the storms yet to come. The mansion, with its eerie opulence and shifting shadows, seemed to close in around us, a silent witness to Gatsby's confession. "But it's not too late," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of my own fear. You can still change things. You can still... Gatsby's smile was sad and distant, his gaze returning to the green light. No, Nick. Some dreams are too deeply woven into the fabric of our souls. They cannot be undone. The sense of foreboding was almost unbearable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The shadows around us pulsed with a dark energy, whispering secrets and promises of things yet to come. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Gatsby turned to me one last time, his expression one of quiet resignation. Remember this, Nick. Dreams can be a blessing or a curse, and sometimes the line between them is so thin, it's almost invisible. With that, he turned and walked back into the mansion, his figure swallowed by the darkness. I stood alone on the terrace, the chill of the morning air seeping into my bones. The green light flickered in the distance, a ghostly beacon that seemed to promise both hope and despair. The mansion loomed behind me, its grand facade a stark reminder of the darkness that lay within. The sense of unease lingered, a constant presence that whispered of the shadows that haunted Gatsby's dreams. And as I stood there, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the gloom, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just players in a dark, twisted tale, our fates intertwined by forces beyond our understanding. The dream that Gatsby had built was a fragile, dangerous thing, teetering on the edge of a precipice. And as the shadows whispered their secrets, I knew that the darkness was far from finished with us. The sense of foreboding was a constant reminder that, in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly gone, and the dreams we chase can sometimes lead us into the darkest corners of our souls. Chapter 7. The summer's heat had taken on an almost supernatural quality, an oppressive, suffocating force that seemed to wrap itself around West Egg like a living, breathing entity. The air was thick and heavy, shimmering with a strange, almost malevolent intensity that made every breath feel like an effort. It was as if the heat had a life of its own, a dark presence that hung over everything, pressing down with a relentless, smothering weight. I could feel the weight of the heat even in the walls of my modest home, the shadows lengthening and twisting in ways that made my skin crawl. The usual bustle of servants and guests at Gatsby's mansion had diminished to a ghostly whisper, the heat driving everyone indoors, where the oppressive air seemed to amplify the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Gatsby moved through his mansion like a restless specter, his eyes darting nervously from one shadowed corner to the next. The heat seemed to cling to him, beads of sweat trickling down his brow as he tried to maintain his usual air of calm control. But there was an edge to his movements, a jittery, almost frantic energy that betrayed the anxiety roiling within him. The phone calls from Daisy had become more frequent, her voice on the line tinged with a frantic urgency that only served to heighten my own sense of foreboding. It was clear that the heat was taking its toll on everyone, fraying nerves and amplifying the underlying conflicts that had been simmering for so long. One particularly brutal afternoon, as the sun blazed mercilessly in the cloudless sky, I received a call from Gatsby. His voice, usually so controlled and confident, was strained and desperate. "Nick, I need you to come over. It's important," Gatsby said, his words almost a plea. Sensing that something had shifted, that the simmering tension was about to boil over, I made my way to Gatsby's mansion. The oppressive heat pressed down on me like a physical weight, the very air shimmering with an unnatural intensity, distorting my vision and making my head throb with a dull, insistent ache. When I arrived, Gatsby was waiting for me in the grand foyer, his face pale and drawn, eyes glittering with a feverish light. The air inside the mansion was thick and stifling, the heat trapped within the walls like a living thing, amplifying the sense of claustrophobic dread that hung over everything. "We're going to the Buchanans," Gatsby said without preamble, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Daisy, she needs us." I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the oppressive heat. There was something in Gatsby's eyes, a desperate, haunted look that spoke of unspoken fears and dark secrets. The drive to East Egg was a slow, torturous crawl through the sweltering heat. The road shimmered like a mirage, the distant trees and houses distorted and wavering in the intense sunlight. The tension between Gatsby and me was palpable, an unspoken dread hanging over us as we approached the Buchanan mansion. As we pulled up to the grand estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a trap, a dark and dangerous game that had been set in motion long before we arrived. The air seemed to grow even heavier, the shadows deepening as we made our way up the steps and into the oppressive heat of the Buchanan home. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling, the air thick with a tension that crackled like static electricity. Tom and Daisy were there, their faces drawn and strained, eyes flickering with a mix of anger and fear. The oppressive heat seemed to amplify the simmering conflicts between them, the very walls of the mansion pulsing with a dark, foreboding energy. We gathered in the dimly lit drawing room, the sense of impending doom almost suffocating. The heat pressed down on us, a relentless, malevolent force that seemed to mirror the rising tensions and unspoken conflicts that threatened to tear us all apart. The stage was set, the players in place, and the dark storm that had been gathering for so long was about to break. The oppressive heat, the simmering conflicts, the underlying menace, all of it coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic dread that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. And as the shadows lengthened and the oppressive heat bore down on us, it became clear that the events of that day would change everything, leaving a trail of darkness and despair in their wake. The drive to the Buchanan's house felt like a journey through a fever dream. The oppressive heat bore down on us, distorting the landscape with its shimmering intensity. As we pulled up to the grand estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a trap, a dark and dangerous game that had been set in motion long before our arrival. The Buchanan mansion loomed before us, its white facade gleaming unnaturally in the harsh sunlight. The air was thick and heavy, the shadows cast by the tall columns and manicured hedges seeming to twist and writhe like living things. There was an eerie stillness about the place, a silence that seemed to pulse with a dark, foreboding energy. Gatsby and I made our way up the steps, the heat pressing down on us like a physical weight. The door opened before we could knock, a servant ushering us into the cool, dimly lit interior. The contrast between the oppressive heat outside and the unnatural chill within was jarring, a disorienting shift that set my nerves on edge. We were led to the drawing room where Daisy and Tom awaited us. The room was bathed in a subdued, almost sickly light that filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, the oppressive heat outside seeming to seep into the very fabric of the house, amplifying the underlying conflicts that simmered just beneath the surface. Daisy rose to greet us, her smile strained and her eyes wide with a frantic, almost desperate energy. "Gatsby, Nick, so glad you could come," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Tom stood by the fireplace, his expression a mask of cold indifference, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, anger, suspicion, perhaps even fear. "Welcome," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken menace. Gatsby's eyes never left Daisy, his gaze filled with a strange, almost otherworldly intensity. "Daisy," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of longing and desperation. The atmosphere was suffocating, the sense of foreboding growing stronger with each passing moment. We took our seats, the silence stretching out between us like a dark chasm, filled with unspoken words and hidden dangers. Tom broke the silence, his voice sharp and accusatory. "So, Gatsby, what is it that you do exactly?" Gatsby's smile was tight, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'm in the business of making dreams come true," he replied evenly, his gaze never wavering. Tom's eyes narrowed, his suspicion evident. "Is that so? And what kind of dreams are we talking about?" Gatsby's smile faded, his expression hardening. "The kind that people like you can never understand." The tension in the room was palpable, a a dark undercurrent that seemed to thrum through the air. Daisy's eyes darted nervously between Gatsby and Tom, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress in a white-knuckled grip. Tom leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what you want, Gatsby? You think your money and your fancy parties can erase the past?" Gatsby's gaze darkened, his voice a cold whisper. "The past is not as set in stone as you think, Tom. People change. Circumstances change." The words hung in the air like a dark promise, the shadows around us deepening, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. The oppressive heat outside seemed to press in on us, the very walls of the mansion pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. Daisy's voice broke the tension, her tone pleading and desperate. "Please, Tom, Gatsby, can we not do this now? It's too hot, too much." Tom's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hard edge to his gaze. "Fine, Daisy, but this isn't over." The sense of unease lingered, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. We moved to the dining room where a lavish spread had been laid out, but the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to enjoy the meal. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, the dark undercurrents of our interactions tainting every bite. The strained interactions and hidden animosities between us created a suffocating sense of dread, a feeling that something terrible was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. The oppressive heat outside seemed to seep into the very walls of the mansion, amplifying the tension and casting long, eerie shadows that danced and flickered in the dim light. As we finished the meal, the sense of foreboding reached a fever pitch. The shadows seemed to close in around us, the dark energy in the room almost tangible. The oppressive heat, the simmering conflicts, the hidden dangers, all of it coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic dread that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. And as we prepared to leave for the Plaza Hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something terrible, a dark storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break at any moment. The decision to go to the Plaza Hotel was made in a haze of oppressive heat and rising tension. The air in the Buchanan mansion had grown stifling, the dark energy from the earlier confrontation hanging over us like a pall. Daisy, her face flushed and eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation, was the first to suggest leaving. "Let's go to town," she said, her voice trembling. "It's too hot here. We need a change of scenery." Her suggestion was met with a heavy silence, the shadows in the room seeming to pulse and shift as we all processed the idea. Tom's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark and dangerous crossing his face, but he nodded in agreement. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "Let's go." The oppressive heat outside hit us like a physical force as we stepped out of the mansion. The sunlight was blinding, the air shimmering with a strange, almost malevolent intensity. We piled into Tom's car, the leather seats scorching hot, the air inside the vehicle thick and suffocating. The drive to the Plaza Hotel was a slow, torturous crawl through the sweltering streets. The city seemed to warp and twist in the heat, the buildings looming like dark sentinels, their windows glinting with a sinister light. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on us, amplifying the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I sat in the back seat with Gatsby, his face set in a grim mask, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Daisy and Tom were in the front, their strained silence a stark contrast to the usual banter that filled our journeys. The air was thick with unspoken words, the dark undercurrents of our interactions creating an almost palpable sense of dread. The city seemed to close in around us as we drove, the streets narrowing, the buildings leaning in as if they were watching our every move. The shadows cast by the towering structures twisted and writhed, taking on grotesque shapes that made my skin crawl. As we neared the plaza, the tension in the car became almost unbearable. The oppressive heat had sapped our energy, leaving us irritable and on edge. The radio, usually a source of light-hearted distraction, now seemed to emit a low, ominous hum, the music distorted and eerie. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Daisy sat stiffly beside him, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress in a white-knuckled grip. Gatsby was a silent presence beside me, his face unreadable, but there was a dark intensity in his eyes that spoke of the storm brewing within him. The air between us crackled with tension, the dark energy from earlier in the day still hanging over us like a cloud. The Plaza Hotel loomed ahead, its grand facade casting long, eerie shadows on the street. The air seemed to grow even heavier as we approached, the sense of foreboding intensifying with each passing moment. The car came to a stop, the engine ticking and cooling in the oppressive heat, and we stepped out into the blinding sunlight. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was no less stifling. The air was thick and heavy, the oppressive heat seeming to seep into the very walls. The grand lobby, usually so welcoming and elegant, now felt dark and foreboding, the shadows cast by the chandeliers dancing and flickering in a sinister display. We made our way to a private suite, the silence between us growing heavier with each step. The hallway stretched out before us like a tunnel, the dark wood paneling and dim lighting creating a claustrophobic, unsettling atmosphere. The sense of impending doom was almost suffocating, the dark energy from earlier in the day now a constant, oppressive presence. As we entered the suite, the oppressive heat seemed to press in on us even more. The air was thick with tension, the strained interactions and unspoken conflicts creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The room was filled with dark, heavy furniture, the curtains drawn tightly against the blinding sunlight, casting the space in an eerie, dim light. We took our seats, the silence stretching out between us like a dark chasm. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and shift, the oppressive atmosphere amplifying the tension and suspicion that hung over us. The air was thick with the weight of our unspoken words, the dark undercurrents of our interactions creating a sense of impending doom. Tom broke the silence, his voice sharp and accusatory. "So, Gatsby, what are your intentions with Daisy?" Gatsby's eyes blazed with a cold fury, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "My intentions are my own, Tom, but rest assured, they are honorable." The words hung in the air like a dark promise, the shadows around us deepening, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. The oppressive heat outside seemed to press in on us, the very walls of the suite pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. Daisy's voice broke the tension, her tone pleading and desperate. "Please, Tom, Gatsby, can we not do this now? It's too hot, too much." The sense of unease lingered, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. We sat in the stifling room, the dark undercurrents of our interactions creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The oppressive heat, the simmering conflicts, the hidden dangers, all of it coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic unease that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. And as we prepared to face the storm brewing between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something terrible, a dark storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break at any moment. The suite at the Plaza Hotel was suffocating, the air thick with a tension that was almost palpable. The oppressive heat outside seemed to press in on us, the dark energy from earlier in the day now, a constant oppressive presence. The grand room with its heavy drapes and dark wood furnishings felt more like a tomb than a place of refuge, the shadows cast by the dim light creating an eerie, foreboding atmosphere. We sat in a strained silence, the oppressive weight of unspoken words hanging over us like a dark cloud. The air was charged with a sense of impending doom, a feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. Tom stood by the window, his back to us, his posture tense and rigid. Daisy sat on the edge of her seat, her eyes darting nervously between Gatsby and Tom, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress in a white-knuckled grip. Gatsby's gaze was fixed on Tom, his eyes blazing with a cold, intense fury. There was a darkness about him, a sense of barely contained rage that seemed to pulse through the room, amplifying the already suffocating tension. Tom turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Gatsby. "All right, Gatsby," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Let's hear it. What is it that you want from Daisy?" Gatsby's jaw tightened, his voice a cold, controlled whisper. "I want her to leave you, Tom. I want her to come with me." The words hung in the air like a dark incantation, the shadows in the room deepening as the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Daisy's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Tom's laugh was harsh and mocking, a sound that seemed to echo unnaturally in the oppressive silence. "You really think you can just waltz in here and take her away from me? You think your money and your fancy parties can erase the past?" Gatsby's eyes blazed with a cold fury, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The past is not as set in stone as you think, Tom. People change. Circumstances change." The tension in the room was suffocating, the dark undercurrents of their conversation creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The air seemed to thrum with a dark energy, the oppressive heat pressing in on us, amplifying the sense of claustrophobic unease. Tom took a step forward, his voice a menacing whisper. "You think you can make her happy? You think you can give her what she needs? You're nothing but a fraud, Gatsby. A cheap, dime-store magician with a bag of tricks and no substance." Gatsby's expression hardened, his voice icy. "You don't know anything about me, Tom. You don't know what I've been through, what I've sacrificed." Tom's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with venom. "Oh, I know more than you think. I know about your so-called business dealings, your shady past. You think you can hide behind your money and your mansion, but the truth has a way of catching up with you." The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting into grotesque shapes. The oppressive atmosphere was almost unbearable, the dark energy from their confrontation creating a sense of impending doom that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. Daisy's voice broke the tension, her tone pleading and desperate. "Please, Tom, Gatsby, can we not do this now? It's too much. Too much." Tom ignored her, his eyes locked onto Gatsby with a fierce intensity. "You want to know the truth, Gatsby? The truth is, Daisy loves me. She'll never leave me for you. You're nothing but a passing fancy, a distraction. She'll come to her senses, and you'll be left with nothing." Gatsby's eyes blazed with a cold, unyielding fury, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You're wrong, Tom. She loves me. She's always loved me. And she's going to leave you." The sense of impending doom was almost suffocating, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the oppressive atmosphere amplifying the sense of dread and anticipation. Daisy's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "Stop it, both of you. Please, just stop." Tom's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hard edge to his gaze. "Fine, Daisy, but this isn't over." The oppressive heat, the simmering conflicts, the hidden dangers, all of it coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic unease that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. The confrontation had left us all on edge, the dark undercurrents of our interactions creating a sense of impending doom that seemed to seep into the very walls of the suite. As we sat in the stifling room, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, a constant reminder that the dark storm brewing between us was far from finished. The shadows whispered their secrets, the darkness pressing in around us, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly gone, and the dreams we chase can sometimes lead us into the darkest corners of our souls. And as the confrontation reached its climax, the sense of impending doom hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud, a reminder that the forces at play in our lives were far from finished. The shadows lengthened, The oppressive heat pressed in on us, and the dark energy from their confrontation created a sense of dread and anticipation that left us all on edge, waiting for the storm to break. The aftermath of the confrontation left us all reeling, the oppressive tension clinging to us like a dark shadow as we made our way out of the Plaza Hotel. The oppressive heat of the summer night had not abated, and the air felt thick and stifling, pressing down on us with a relentless, malevolent force. Gatsby and Daisy climbed into Gatsby's car, their faces pale and strained, the dark energy of the evening still crackling between them. I watched them drive away, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a shroud. Tom and I took his car, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words and simmering resentment. The streets of New York were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the city muted by the oppressive heat and the dark events of the night. As we approached the Valley of Ashes, the sense of dread grew stronger, the dark landscape taking on an almost otherworldly quality. The flickering lights of the industrial wasteland cast long, grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of my vision. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and decay, the oppressive atmosphere amplifying the sense of impending doom. Gatsby and Daisy were ahead of us, their car a dark silhouette against the shimmering heat of the road. The night seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening, the oppressive heat pressing down with a relentless force. It was as if the very air was charged with a dark, malevolent energy, a sense of impending disaster hanging over us like a dark cloud. And then, it happened. In the blink of an eye, a figure darted out onto the road, a flash of movement in the oppressive darkness. There was a sickening thud, the sound of metal crumpling and glass shattering, and then silence. A deafening, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt, the acrid smell of burnt rubber filling the air. We stumbled out of the car, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night pressing in on us as we approached the scene of the accident. Gatsby's car was stopped in the middle of the road, the front end crumpled and smoking. And there, lying motionless on the ground, was Myrtle Wilson, her body twisted and broken, the life drained from her eyes. The horror of the scene was almost unbearable, the dark reality of what had happened sinking in with a sickening weight. Daisy stood by the car, her face a mask of shock and horror, her hands trembling. Gatsby was beside her, his expression a mix of fear and determination, his eyes blazing with a cold, unyielding intensity. Tom's face contorted with rage and grief, his eyes fixed on Myrtle's lifeless body. The air was thick with the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night, the sense of impending doom now a horrifying reality. Gatsby moved to Daisy's side, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "We need to go, Daisy. Now." Daisy nodded numbly, her eyes wide with shock and fear. They climbed back into the car, the engine roaring to life, and sped away into the darkness, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night swallowing them up. Tom stood frozen, his face a mask of rage and grief, the dark reality of what had happened sinking in with a sickening weight. I moved to his side, the oppressive heat pressing down on us, the dark energy of the night creating a sense of impending doom that seemed to seep into our very bones. As we stood there, the reality of what had happened sinking in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all caught in a dark and dangerous game, the forces at play far beyond our control. The shadows around us seemed to pulse with a dark energy, whispering secrets and promises of things yet to come. The oppressive heat, the simmering conflicts, the hidden dangers, all of it coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic dread that hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. The night was filled with the sound of sirens, the flickering lights of emergency vehicles casting eerie shadows on the ground. And as we stood there, the sense of impending doom growing stronger, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark forces at play in our lives were far from finished. The shadows whispered their secrets, the darkness pressing in around us, a reminder that in Gatsby's world, the past was never truly gone, and the dreams we chase can sometimes lead us into the darkest corners of our souls. As the night wore on, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the evening creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, I realized that the events of that night had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The dark storm brewing on the horizon was far from finished, and the forces at play in our lives were far from done with us. The sense of horror and shock from the tragic accident lingered, a chilling reminder of the dark and fateful forces shaping our lives. And as I looked out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 8. The dawn broke over West Egg with a muted, ghostly light, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the desolate landscape. The air was heavy with a strange, oppressive stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of the night's horrors. Gatsby's mansion loomed like a dark sentinel, its grand facade now shrouded in an almost palpable sense of doom. Inside, the silence was deafening, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling quiet. The grand halls and opulent rooms were cloaked in shadow, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes and casting distorted, flickering shapes on the walls. It was as if the very house was mourning, its once vibrant heart now stilled by the weight of tragedy. Gatsby sat alone in his study, the air around him thick with a sense of eerie stillness. His eyes were dark and haunted, the shadows beneath them deep and pronounced. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, a relentless, nightmarish loop that he could not escape. The memory of Myrtle's lifeless body, twisted and broken on the road, was seared into his consciousness, a dark specter that refused to be banished. He tried to focus on the light that filtered through the window, but it only served to highlight the darkness that had settled over him. His thoughts turned to Daisy, her face pale and stricken with fear as she stood beside him, the realization of what had happened dawning in her wide, terrified eyes. He had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the consequences of their actions, but now he felt powerless, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and dread. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe, taking on grotesque shapes that made his skin crawl. The house itself felt alive, the walls whispering dark secrets, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Gatsby's thoughts were a tangled web of haunting memories, each one a sharp, painful reminder of the past that had led him to this moment. He thought of Daisy, their first meeting, the way her laughter had filled the air like music, the way her eyes had sparkled with a light that seemed to promise a future free of shadows. But those promises had been empty, the light now extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their circumstances. The dreams he had built, the future he had envisioned, now seemed like distant, unattainable fantasies, slipping through his fingers like sand. The house creaked and groaned, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional eerie sounds that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Gatsby's thoughts drifted back to his youth, to the choices he had made, the paths he had taken. He remembered the desperation that had driven him, the fierce determination to escape the shadows of his past and create a new life, a life worthy of Daisy's love. But now, in the cold light of dawn, those dreams seemed like dark illusions, the shadows of his past reaching out to reclaim him. As the hours passed, the sense of dread grew stronger, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on him with a relentless, suffocating weight. The memories that plagued him took on a life of their own, dark specters that haunted his every thought, whispering of the doom that awaited him. The past was inescapable, its dark tendrils wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the shadows. The mansion, once a symbol of his success and dreams, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around him, the air thick with the weight of his fears and regrets. The sense of impending doom was almost tangible, a dark, oppressive presence that seemed to permeate every corner of his world. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its harsh, unforgiving light on the world, Gatsby felt the shadows deepen, the sense of dread intensify. The past, with all its dark secrets and haunting memories, was catching up to him, and there was no escape. The future he had dreamed of was slipping away, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of the present. Gatsby's reflections were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. He stood, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, and made his way to the door, the sense of dread growing with each step. As he reached for the handle, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible awaited him on the other side, a dark specter that would finally bring his world crashing down. The knock at the door turned out to be me, my face ashen, eyes wide with concern. Gatsby ushered me into the dimly lit study, the shadows cast by the flickering light creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. The oppressive air seemed to thicken as we settled into our chairs, an unspoken understanding hanging heavy between us. Gatsby's eyes were dark, haunted by the memories that clung to him like a shroud. The silence stretched, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us both. Finally, Gatsby broke the silence, his voice a low, almost whispering murmur, as if speaking too loudly might awaken the dark forces that lingered just beyond the edges of his mind. "I want to tell you about Daisy," he said, his gaze distant, lost in the shadows of the past. "About how it all began, and how it all went wrong." I nodded, sensing the gravity of what was to come. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening as Gatsby began to speak, his words weaving a tale of love and loss, of dreams and nightmares. "It was 5 years ago," Gatsby began, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and despair. "We met in Louisville during the war. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, like a vision out of a dream. Her laughter was like music, her eyes sparkling with a light that seemed to promise a future free of shadows." He paused, his eyes flickering with a dark, haunted light. But that promise was an illusion. Even then there were shadows lurking, dark forces that would eventually tear us apart. Gatsby's voice trembled slightly as he continued, the memories of their time together taking on a life of their own, dark specters that haunted his every word. He spoke of their secret meetings, the stolen moments of joy and passion, the dreams they had built together. But beneath the surface of his words, there was an undercurrent of darkness, a sense of inevitable tragedy that cast a pall over their love. "She promised to wait for me," Gatsby said, his voice a whisper filled with sorrow. "But when I returned from the war, she was gone. Married to Tom Buchanan, her life intertwined with his in a way that I could never untangle." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air growing colder, more oppressive. Gatsby's memories took on a sinister quality, the love he had for Daisy tainted by the dark forces that had conspired to keep them apart. "I tried to find her," Gatsby continued, his voice trembling with the weight of his memories. "I did everything I could to bring her back to me. I built this mansion, threw those parties, all in the hope that one day she would walk through those doors and everything would be as it was. But the shadows of the past are not so easily dispelled." I listened, the sense of dread growing stronger with each word. Gatsby's tale was not just one of love lost, but of dreams corrupted, of dark forces that had shaped their destinies in ways they could never have foreseen. "Every time I saw her with Tom," Gatsby said, his voice a low, anguished whisper, "it was like a knife twisting in my heart. But I couldn't let her go. I was consumed by the need to have her back, to reclaim the dream that had slipped through my fingers." The air in the room grew colder still, the shadows lengthening, deepening. Gatsby's memories were like dark tendrils reaching out to ensnare him, to pull him back into the past he could never escape. "And now," Gatsby said, his voice filled with a terrible resignation, "everything is falling apart. The dream I built is crumbling, the shadows closing in, the past has caught up with me, and there's no escaping the darkness that it brings." The oppressive atmosphere in the room was almost unbearable, the sense of impending doom palpable. Gatsby's tale of love and loss, of dreams tainted by dark forces, left me with a chilling realization. The past could never truly be escaped, and the shadows that lingered over their lives were far from finished with them. As Gatsby's voice trailed off, the room seemed to grow even darker, the sense of unease and dread thickening the air. I could see the haunted look in Gatsby's eyes, the shadows that clung to him like a second skin, a reminder of the dark and fateful forces at play in their lives. And as we sat in the oppressive stillness, the weight of Gatsby's memories pressing down on us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom hung over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. Leaving Gatsby's mansion felt like stepping out of a haunted house, the dark, oppressive atmosphere lingering in my mind even as I walked away. The night was unnaturally still, the oppressive heat pressing down on me with a relentless, suffocating force. The shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to stretch and twist in grotesque shapes, dancing in the corners of my vision like dark specters. As I walked back to my modest home, the events of the night replayed in my mind, a relentless nightmarish loop that I couldn't escape. Gatsby's haunted eyes, the dark undercurrents of his tale, the sense of inevitable tragedy that hung over us all. It was as if the shadows of his past had reached out to ensnare me, pulling me into their dark, suffocating embrace. The closer I got to my house, the more the sense of dread grew. The familiar path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the once comforting surroundings now shrouded in an eerie, almost sinister light. The oppressive heat seemed to press in on me, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. I reached my door, my hand trembling slightly as I fumbled with the key. The house was dark and silent, the usual comforting sounds of the night replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air inside was stifling, the oppressive heat seeping into every corner, amplifying the sense of claustrophobic unease. I moved through the darkened rooms, the shadows twisting and shifting around me, whispering dark secrets that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of moonlight through the windows, seemed to carry a sense of impending doom, a reminder of the dark forces at play in our lives. I settled into a chair by the window, my mind racing, the events of the night playing out in vivid, haunting detail. Gatsby's tale of love and loss, the dark specters that haunted his memories, the sense of inevitable tragedy, it all weighed heavily on me, a dark, oppressive presence that I couldn't shake. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the room, the flickering light creating grotesque shapes that seemed to dance and writhe on the walls. The oppressive heat pressed down on me, the air thick with a sense of foreboding, the shadows whispering dark secrets that seemed to echo in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond the edges of my consciousness, a dark specter that waited for the right moment to reveal itself. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, the shadows growing darker, the sense of impending doom almost tangible. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each detail taking on a dark, sinister quality. Gatsby's haunted eyes, the dark undercurrents of his tale, the sense of inevitable tragedy that hung over us all. It was as if the shadows of his past had reached out to ensnare me, pulling me into their dark, suffocating embrace. The oppressive heat, the dark energy of the night, the sense of impending doom, it all coalesced into a sense of claustrophobic unease that hung over me like a dark, suffocating cloud. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As I sat there, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me, the shadows whispering their dark secrets, I realized that the events of the night had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The dark storm brewing on the horizon was far from finished, and the forces at play in our lives were far from done with us. And as the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night created an almost unbearable sense of dread, I realized that the past could never truly be escaped, and the shadows that lingered over our lives were far from finished with us. The sense of horror and dread lingered, a chilling reminder of the dark and fateful forces shaping our lives. And as I looked out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The shadows whispering their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom hanging over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. The night had grown darker, the oppressive heat of the day lingering like a malevolent spirit. In the small, dimly lit garage in the Valley of Ashes, George Wilson was a man consumed by shadows. The flickering light from a single bulb cast eerie, wavering shadows on the walls, giving the place an almost otherworldly feel. Wilson's eyes were hollow, his face a mask of anguish and determination. Myrtle's lifeless body haunted him, her twisted form burned into his mind, a relentless, nightmarish image that refused to fade. The oppressive silence of the garage seemed to amplify his thoughts, each one a dark whisper that echoed in the depths of his soul. The clues were all there, scattered like dark breadcrumbs leading him to the inevitable. He had pieced together the fragments of conversation, the hints, the fleeting glimpses of a yellow car. His mind, once foggy with grief, was now sharpened by a single burning purpose: vengeance. He left the garage, the oppressive heat pressing down on him like a physical force. The night was unnaturally still, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. As he walked, the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, dark specters that danced at the edges of his vision. The streets of the Valley of Ashes were deserted, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. Wilson's madness grew with each step, his thoughts a tangled web of grief and rage. The dark, sinister forces that seemed to guide him whispered their secrets, feeding his anger, pushing him toward the path of destruction. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound a stark reminder of the dark journey he was undertaking. He reached the outskirts of the Valley of Ashes, the desolate landscape giving way to the opulence of West Egg. The contrast was stark, the dark, oppressive shadows of the industrial wasteland replaced by the eerie, almost supernatural glow of Gatsby's mansion in the distance. The lights of the mansion flickered like distant stars, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to beckon him closer. Wilson's grip tightened on the pistol in his hand, the cold metal a comforting weight in the midst of his madness. The dark whispers grew louder, urging him on, promising retribution for the wrongs that had been done. The sense of impending doom was almost palpable, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. As he approached Gatsby's mansion, the sense of dread grew stronger. The grand facade of the mansion loomed before him, its opulence now taking on a dark, sinister quality. The shadows cast by the flickering lights seemed to pulse and shift, the oppressive atmosphere creating a sense of claustrophobic unease. Wilson's madness had reached its peak, his thoughts consumed by a single, burning purpose. The dark forces that guided him whispered their final commands, pushing him toward the inevitable confrontation. The air was thick with tension, the sense of impending doom hanging over him like a dark cloud. He reached the gate of the mansion, his heart pounding in his chest, the dark whispers growing louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the oppressive atmosphere amplifying the sense of dread. He knew what he had to do, the dark path laid out before him with a terrible, inescapable clarity. As Wilson made his way through the darkened grounds of the mansion, the sense of impending doom was almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. The mansion loomed before him, a dark sentinel in the night, its opulence now a stark reminder of the wrongs that had been done. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on him, the dark whispers urging him on. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he raised the pistol, the sense of dread and anticipation almost unbearable. The dark forces that guided him promised retribution, vengeance for the wrongs that had been done. And as Wilson stepped into the mansion, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, he knew that the moment of reckoning had come. The dark whispers grew louder, the shadows deepening, and the sense of impending doom hanging over him like a dark, suffocating cloud. The path to Gatsby's mansion had been laid out with dark, sinister forces guiding every step, and now, as Wilson prepared to confront the man he believed was responsible for his wife's death, the sense of impending doom was almost tangible. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of retribution, and the dark storm brewing on the horizon was far from finished. The mansion was eerily quiet as Wilson made his way through the grand halls, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the oppressive silence. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, dark specters that watched his every move, whispering dark secrets that fed his madness. The air was thick with tension, the sense of impending doom hanging over him like a dark, suffocating cloud. I was still reeling from Gatsby's haunting tale when the crack of a gunshot shattered the heavy stillness. My heart leaped into my throat, and I found myself running, driven by a dread I couldn't quite comprehend. As I reached the study, the sight before me rooted me to the spot in horror. Gatsby was standing by the window, gazing out at the green light across the bay, a symbol of his undying hope, now tainted by the dark events of the night. The room was filled with an oppressive stillness, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. Wilson's eyes were wild, his face contorted with grief and rage as he burst into the room. Gatsby turned, his expression one of confusion and shock as he faced the madman who had come to exact his revenge. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as the confrontation reached its terrible climax. "You killed her!" Wilson's voice was a raw, anguished scream, the sound echoing off the walls with a haunting, unnatural resonance. "You took everything from me!" Gatsby's eyes widened, his voice a desperate plea. "I didn't kill anyone. You've got it all wrong." But Wilson was beyond reason, his mind consumed by a dark, all-encompassing madness. He raised the pistol, the cold metal glinting in the dim light, his hand trembling with the weight of his grief and rage. The shadows seemed to close in around them, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The shot rang out, a deafening final sound that shattered the oppressive silence. Gatsby staggered, a look of shock and disbelief on his face as he crumpled to the floor, the life draining from his eyes. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the sense of horror and shock almost unbearable. Wilson stood over Gatsby's lifeless body, his face a mask of anguish and despair. The dark forces that had guided him whispered their final commands, pushing him toward the inescapable conclusion. He turned the pistol on himself, the final shot echoing through the grand halls, a chilling testament to the dark, fateful forces at play. I arrived moments later, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me as I entered the room. The sight that greeted me was one of pure horror. Gatsby's lifeless body, a pool of dark, crimson blood spreading across the floor, Wilson's body slumped nearby, the pistol still clutched in his hand. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, whispering dark secrets that sent chills down my spine. The sense of impending doom, now realized in the most tragic of ways, hung over the scene like a dark, suffocating cloud. The air was thick with the weight of the night's events, the oppressive heat amplifying the sense of horror and shock. As I stood there, the full weight of the tragedy pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark forces at play in Gatsby's world were far from finished. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the sense of impending doom lingering in the air, a chilling reminder that the past could never truly be escaped. The green light across the bay flickered in the distance, a haunting symbol of the dreams and hopes that had been shattered. The dark, fateful forces that had shaped Gatsby's life had brought him to this tragic end, a stark reminder of the inescapable shadows that lingered over us all. And as I looked out into the darkness, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the night creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, I realized that the shadows of the past were far from finished with us. The sense of horror and shock lingered, a chilling testament to the dark, fateful forces that had shaped our lives, and the realization that the past could never truly be escaped. Chapter 9. The morning after Gatsby's death, the world seemed cloaked in an eerie stillness. The oppressive heat of the previous days had given way to a heavy, leaden sky, casting a pall over the mansion and its grounds. Gatsby's grand estate, once vibrant with the sounds of laughter and music, now stood silent and desolate, like a tombstone marking the end of an era. I arrived early, the oppressive silence pressing down on me as I made my way through the deserted halls. The air inside the mansion was thick with a sense of foreboding. The shadows cast by the dim light from the windows seemed to stretch and writhe, whispering dark secrets that echoed through the empty rooms. The memories of the past clung to every surface, haunting reminders of the life that had once filled these grand spaces. The staff moved about like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, their movements mechanical. The usual hum of activity was absent, replaced by an unsettling quiet that seemed to amplify the sense of loss and tragedy. Gatsby's death had cast a long shadow over the estate, a darkness that seemed to seep into every corner, every crevice, leaving nothing untouched. I made my way to Gatsby's study, the room where we had spent so many hours talking, dreaming, and planning. The sight that greeted me was one of stark contrast to those memories. The grand desk, once cluttered with papers and plans, now lay bare, the empty chair behind it a haunting reminder of its absent occupant. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and leather, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint rustling of the curtains in the still air. As I stood there, the weight of Gatsby's death pressed down on me, a dark, suffocating presence that seemed to fill the room. The shadows cast by the dim light danced on the walls, their movements almost sinister, as if the very house was mourning the loss of its master. The sense of impending doom that had hung over Gatsby in his final days now seemed to linger, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The news of Gatsby's death had spread quickly, but the reactions of those around him were shockingly indifferent. The guests who had once flocked to his lavish parties, eager to bask in the glow of his wealth and charm, now seemed to vanish into thin air. The calls and telegrams that poured in were not expressions of sympathy or grief, but rather inquiries about the next party, the next spectacle, as if Gatsby's death was just another passing event in the relentless march of time. Even Daisy and Tom, who had been at the center of so much of the tragedy, were nowhere to be found. Their mansion in East Egg stood as silent and foreboding as Gatsby's, the echoes of their lives now ghostly whispers that seemed to blend with the oppressive silence. It was as if they had vanished into the ether, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. The haunting atmosphere of Gatsby's mansion weighed heavily on me as I made my way through the empty halls, the memories of the past echoing with every step. The grand staircase, the ballroom, the library, all stood silent, their once vibrant life now extinguished. The sense of eerie stillness was almost palpable, a dark reminder of the fleeting nature of dreams and the inescapable grip of fate. As I left the mansion, the oppressive silence followed me, the dark shadows of the past lingering in my mind. The world outside seemed just as still, the heavy sky pressing down with an almost supernatural weight. The sense of dread that had permeated Gatsby's final days now seemed to extend beyond the mansion, a dark cloud that hung over West Egg and East Egg alike, a chilling testament to the forces that had shaped and ultimately destroyed Gatsby's dream. And as I walked away, the memories of Gatsby's life and death haunting my every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was far from finished with us. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom lingered, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to lift. The day after Gatsby's death, I found myself in the surreal position of arranging his funeral. The oppressive silence of the mansion was now joined by an unsettling sense of urgency, as if the very walls were whispering dark secrets and urging me to hurry before something else went terribly wrong. I reached out to everyone I could think of, but the responses I received were disheartening. The very people who had once flocked to Gatsby's parties, who had basked in the glow of his opulence and charm, were now conspicuously absent. The phone calls were met with cold indifference, the telegrams unanswered, as if Gatsby's death had erased him from their memories as easily as his presence had once dominated their lives. The oppressive heat outside had not relented, the heavy air pressing down with an almost supernatural weight. The mansion, once a beacon of life and energy, now felt like a mausoleum, its grand rooms and opulent decorations a stark contrast to the eerie stillness that filled the air. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, every hallway a whisper of things left unsaid. My frustration grew with each passing hour. I reached out to Wolfsheim, hoping that the man who had been so closely tied to Gatsby's business dealings would show some semblance of loyalty. But even Wolfsheim, with his shadowy connections and sinister demeanor, seemed reluctant to involve himself in the final chapter of Gatsby's life. "I can't get mixed up in this now, Nick," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper over the phone. "You understand how it is. Business is business, and what's done is done." His words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the dark and fateful forces that had always been at play in Gatsby's world. The apathy, the unwillingness to confront the past, was a dark specter that seemed to haunt everyone I contacted. Gatsby's father arrived unexpectedly, his presence both a comfort and a stark reminder of the life Gatsby had left behind. He was a frail man, his face lined with the years of hard living, but his eyes held a quiet strength that spoke of a different era, a different dream. He clung to the memories of the young, hopeful man his son had once been, the shadows of the past casting long, dark shapes over his recollections. We walked through the mansion together, the oppressive silence pressing down on us both. He spoke of Gatsby's youth, of his ambitions and dreams, his voice trembling with the weight of years and the dark realization of what those dreams had ultimately cost. "He was always reaching for something," he said, his voice a whisper in the still air. "Always looking for a way to make the world see him, to prove that he was more than just a poor boy from North Dakota." As we moved through the grand halls, the shadows seemed to close in, the air thick with the sense of impending doom. The memories of Gatsby's life were everywhere, the echoes of laughter and music now replaced by an eerie stillness that spoke of unfulfilled dreams and the dark, inescapable reality of his fate. The day of the funeral arrived, and the oppressive heat had not abated. The sky was a heavy leaden gray, casting a pall over the proceedings. The small group that gathered was a stark contrast to the throngs that had once filled Gatsby's mansion. The faces were few, each one a reminder of the isolation that had ultimately defined Gatsby's life. Daisy and Tom were nowhere to be seen, their absence a dark, silent testament to the superficial bonds that had tied them to Gatsby. The shadows of the past seemed to hang over the small gathering, the air thick with a sense of foreboding and unspoken truths. As we laid Gatsby to rest, the oppressive silence was broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the hot, still air. The sense of impending doom that had hung over Gatsby's final days now seemed to settle over his grave, a dark, suffocating presence that refused to lift. And as I stood there, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was far from finished with us. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom lingered, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to dissipate. In the eerie stillness of that moment, I realized that Gatsby's dream, his relentless pursuit of a future free from the shadows of his past, had ultimately led him to this dark end. The apathy and indifference of those who had once surrounded him were a chilling reminder of the fleeting nature of dreams and the inescapable grip of fate. And as I walked away from Gatsby's grave, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the day creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, I knew that the shadows of the past were far from finished with us. The sense of horror and unease lingered, a chilling testament to the dark and fateful forces that had shaped our lives, and the realization that the past could never truly be escaped. I was pacing the grand hall of Gatsby's mansion, the oppressive silence pressing down on me, when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, a stark reminder of the life that had once filled these halls. I opened the door to find an old man standing on the threshold, his frail frame hunched against the oppressive heat. His appearance was almost spectral, his face lined with the deep creases of hard years, and his eyes shadowed by the weight of untold stories. He held a battered suitcase in one hand, the other clutching a weathered hat to his chest. His eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the shadows of the past had come to life before me. "I'm Henry C. Gatz," he said, his voice a low, tremulous whisper. "I'm James's father." The name sounded foreign on his lips, a reminder of the man Gatsby had once been before he reinvented himself. I stepped aside to let him in, the oppressive heat outside pressing in like a dark presence. As he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room lengthening as if to welcome him. We moved to the study, the room where Gatsby and I had spent so many hours talking and dreaming. The sight of the empty chair, the grand desk now bare, filled me with a deep, unsettling sense of loss. Mr. Gatz settled into a chair, his frail body seeming almost to disappear into the opulence of the room. He looked around, his eyes tracing the contours of the room, as if searching for the ghost of his son. The silence stretched, the air thick with unspoken words and dark memories. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low murmur that seemed to carry the weight of the years. "He was always such a dreamer," he said, his eyes distant, lost in the shadows of the past. "Even as a boy, he was always reaching for something just out of his grasp, always believing that he could make the world see him, make them understand." As he spoke, the room seemed to darken, the shadows closing in around us. His words were filled with a quiet sorrow, the memories of his son tinged with an eerie sense of inevitability. The stories he shared painted a picture of a young man driven by an almost supernatural ambition, a relentless pursuit of a dream that seemed to always elude him. "He used to talk about the big things he was going to do," Mr. Gatz continued, his voice trembling. "About the places he'd go, the people he'd meet. He believed he could change the world, that he could be someone important." The oppressive silence of the room seemed to amplify his words, each one a haunting reminder of the dreams that had driven Gatsby to his tragic end. The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air growing colder, more oppressive. "But there was always something," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something dark, something that seemed to follow him, no matter how far he went. It was like a shadow, always just behind him, whispering that he'd never really escape." I listened, the sense of dread growing with each word. The stories of Gatsby's past were filled with dark undercurrents, hints of the forces that had shaped his life and ultimately led to his downfall. The air in the room was thick with tension, the shadows whispering dark secrets that seemed to echo Mr. Gatz's words. "He changed his name, reinvented himself, but he could never really escape who he was," Mr. Gatz said, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting sorrow. "No matter how high he climbed, the past was always there, just waiting to pull him back down." The oppressive atmosphere in the room was almost unbearable, the sense of impending doom hanging over us like a dark, suffocating cloud. The shadows seemed to close in, the dark energy of the room amplifying the horror of the stories Mr. Gatz shared. As he spoke of Gatsby's final days, the sense of dread reached its peak. The dark forces that had shaped Gatsby's life seemed to be at play even now, their presence a chilling reminder of the inescapable grip of the past. The memories of Gatsby's life were like dark tendrils, reaching out to ensnare us, pulling us into the shadows that had always lingered just beyond the edges of his dreams. And as Mr. Gatz fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was far from finished with us. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom lingered, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to lift. The days following Gatsby's death were filled with an eerie, oppressive stillness. The mansion, once a beacon of life and energy, now stood as a silent monument to a dream that had crumbled into dust. The oppressive heat hung in the air, the atmosphere thick with a sense of unease and foreboding. I found myself alone in the grand, empty halls of Gatsby's mansion, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the hot, still air. The memories of the past echoed through the deserted rooms, a haunting reminder of the life that had once filled these spaces. The laughter, the music, the vibrant energy, all had been replaced by a suffocating sense of dread and disillusionment. As I walked through the mansion, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, whispering dark secrets that fed my growing sense of unease. The faces of those who had once flocked to Gatsby's parties, eager to bask in the glow of his wealth and charm, now seemed like ghostly apparitions, their absence a stark reminder of the superficial nature of their relationships. I thought of Tom and Daisy, their indifference a chilling testament to their true nature. They had used Gatsby, taken what they wanted from him, and discarded him when he was no longer of use. Their betrayal was a dark specter that lingered in my mind, a sinister reminder of the darkness that lay beneath their polished exteriors. I reached out to those who had once called themselves Gatsby's friends, but my efforts were met with cold indifference and silence. The phone calls went unanswered, the telegrams ignored. It was as if Gatsby's death had erased him from their memories, his existence an inconvenient truth they preferred to forget. The apathy and indifference of those around me filled me with a deep sense of dread. The dark undercurrents of their superficial relationships were laid bare, the sinister nature of their betrayals, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their lives. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the sense of impending doom. Even Wolfsheim, who had been so closely tied to Gatsby's business dealings, refused to involve himself in the final chapter of Gatsby's life. His words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the dark and fateful forces that had always been at play in Gatsby's world. "I can't get mixed up in this now, Nick," he had said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "You understand how it is. Business is business, and what's done is done." His indifference was a dark, sinister presence that seemed to linger in the air, a chilling testament to the true nature of those who had surrounded Gatsby in life. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the oppressive atmosphere amplifying the sense of horror and disillusionment. As I stood in the grand, empty halls of Gatsby's mansion, the memories of the past haunting my every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark forces at play in Gatsby's world were far from finished. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom lingered, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to lift. The faces of those who had used Gatsby and abandoned him in death were like ghostly apparitions, their indifference a chilling reminder of the superficial nature of their relationships. The dark undercurrents of their betrayals were laid bare, the sinister nature of their true selves a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their lives. And as I walked away from Gatsby's mansion, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the day creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, I knew that the shadows of the past were far from finished with us. The sense of horror and disillusionment lingered, a chilling testament to the dark and fateful forces that had shaped our lives, and the realization that the past could never truly be escaped. In the days that followed Gatsby's funeral, I found myself haunted by the lingering shadows of his life. The oppressive heat had not abated, and the mansion, once a vibrant beacon of opulence, now stood as a silent, decaying monument to a dream that had crumbled into dust. The grand halls, the empty rooms, the ghostly echoes of laughter and music, all served as chilling reminders of the life that had been extinguished so suddenly and violently. As I wandered through the deserted mansion, the memories of Gatsby's life played out like a dark, twisted film reel in my mind. The faces of those who had once surrounded him, their superficial smiles and false laughter, now seemed like grotesque masks hiding the true darkness of their souls. The sense of foreboding that had always hung over Gatsby's world now felt almost suffocating, a dark cloud that refused to lift. I found myself standing by the pool, the water now eerily still, the scene of Gatsby's tragic end. The green light across the bay flickered in the distance, a haunting symbol of the dreams and hopes that had driven Gatsby to his fate. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the hot, still air, the shadows casting long, sinister shapes on the ground. Gatsby's life had been a relentless pursuit of an ideal, a dream that had ultimately consumed him. The dark forces that had shaped his life, the inescapable shadows of his past, had led him down a path of self-destruction. His mansion, once a symbol of his success, now stood as a grim testament to the futility of his dreams. As I looked out over the water, the memories of Gatsby's final days played out in my mind. His obsessive preparations for his meeting with Daisy, the almost supernatural energy that had driven him, the sense of impending doom that had hung over him like a dark cloud, all had culminated in that final, tragic moment. The dark, fateful forces that had shaped his life were far from finished, their presence a chilling reminder of the inescapable grip of the past. The faces of those who had used Gatsby and abandoned him in death haunted my thoughts. Their indifference, their superficiality, their betrayals, all were dark specters that lingered in my mind, a stark reminder of the true nature of the world Gatsby had tried so desperately to conquer. The shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come. In my final reflections on Gatsby's life and legacy, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness that had consumed him was a reflection of a deeper, more sinister reality. The American dream, with its promises of success and fulfillment, had proven to be a dark and elusive illusion, a specter that had led Gatsby to his doom. The shadows of his past, the dark forces that had shaped his life, were inescapable, their presence a chilling reminder of the futility of his dreams. As I prepared to leave West Egg, the oppressive heat and the dark energy of the day creating an almost unbearable sense of dread, I realized that the past was far from finished with us. The sense of horror and unease lingered, a chilling testament to the dark and fateful forces that had shaped our lives, and the realization that the shadows of the past could never truly be escaped. In the end, Gatsby's life had been a tragic tale of ambition and illusion, a dark reminder of the inescapable grip of the past. The green light, flickering in the distance, was a haunting symbol of the dreams that had driven him to his fate, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of our lives. And as I walked away from the mansion for the last time, the shadows whispered their dark secrets, the air thick with the promise of more tragedy to come, and the sense of impending doom lingered, a dark, suffocating cloud that refused to lift.